Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jennifer Marshall, and I want to welcome you to the 2019 Heritage Foundation Anti-Poverty Forum. It's great to see many old and longtime friends and to see new faces as well. Thank you for joining us. We are gathered here today because we want to see more of our neighbors in need overcome poverty and experience true flourishing. This is an annual gathering of federal and state policymakers, of researchers, and of leaders working directly in communities with those in need. Together, we seek better policy and bolder initiative at a community and interpersonal level to address the problems that perpetuate poverty. Each year, this forum takes place right around the holiday season. It's a time of year when we're seeing all kinds of Christmas shopping, holiday decorations and music, festive dress, lots of food. And yet it's also a time when we're more attuned to the fact that lasting meaning and deeper purpose in life lie beyond these material goods that we enjoy at this season. They lie in family, in friends, in faith, in giving oneself to others, and in exercising our potential through meaningful endeavors. It's a season when we're more likely to step back and to reflect, and to feel more acutely a sense of absence when those deeper sources of meaning feel out of reach. It's a time when we're more likely to be sensitive to these needs in the lives of others as well. And that makes this an appropriate season to stop and take note of how we can serve our neighbors in need well. And that must begin with an understanding that poverty in America goes much deeper than material need. Our program today will focus on two aspects of this deeper need. The first is work as a source of purpose and a sense of dignity. Opening remarks by Nick Eberstadt and our first panel will address this topic. After a short break, around 10:30, our second panel will focus on restoring marriage and community and reweaving the relational fabric that is so important for overcoming poverty and experiencing flourishing. At the end of the morning, we will hear from Congressman Mike Johnson. He will share a legislative perspective on these topics and a closing keynote address by Senator Tim Scott. And the finale of the day will be the presentation of the World Magazine Hope Award for Effective Compassion. So we hope you'll be able to remain with us to the conclusion of the day by 12:15. For those of you who persevere, we will be serving lunch in the foyer as you exit. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker for today. Nick Eberstadt is one of the most accomplished and well-regarded scholars in Washington. His wide-ranging expertise covers issues from poverty and demographics to economic development and international security in Asia. Nick is the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he has worked since 1985. Over the past 4 decades, he's published some 20 books. Nick's recent book, Men Without Work, showed how increasing numbers of men in the prime of life are detached from work and what this means for their well-being as well as the communities around them. Today, we've asked him to present an update on these trends and their implications for our society. As you'll see, Nick's work is distinguished by the fact that he's an extraordinary student of data, but not just a student. He's also a teacher of data, and he makes vast amounts of quantitative data accessible to those of us who don't spend our days studying spreadsheets. But Nick does not merely teach us numbers, he makes data come to life by helping us better understand the needs of our neighbors. He helps us grapple with the vague anxieties we have about social trends and makes the world more intelligible for action. There is much about our frenetic, data-driven world that has made us less human. Nick Eberstadt uses data in a way that makes us more human, by helping us see more clearly the humanity of those around us and how we can respond to challenges today and for the future of our nation. Please join me in welcoming Nick Eberstadt.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to salute you and your colleagues at Heritage for organizing this critically important forum every year. Bless you for that. What I'm going to do in my allotted time, if this is the click, yeah, there we go. Let's try it backwards. There we are. I'm going to share with you some homework that's been bothering me about things that are wounding our country. What I'm going to share with you has to do with about the collapse of work for men in America. This is not a new problem. It has been gathering for half a century, but somehow our deciders and our explainers inside our bubble have missed what's going on outside of the better zip codes in America. And we've got a little bit to be happy about since I wrote this book 3 years ago, but it sure isn't time to pop out the champagne yet. I'm going to show you what I mean. Well, if all we were interested in the US was our wealth generating engine, we could go home happy right now and shut down our Anti-Poverty Forum, because the United States is still the wonder of the world in generating private wealth. As of this year, private wealth per capita is almost $400,000 per person if you divided it all up exactly evenly, over $1.5 million per notional family of 4. We've added 20 trillion, that's with a T, since the time I wrote this book, to America's per capita wealth. We've added a full China. We have, it's just an extraordinary success that we have if we only look at this. But there's another side to it, which I want to focus on now. And that's what's happened with work. We've had a boom in wealth for wealth holders, but we've also had a collapse in the availability or the amount of work for workers. And you can see what's happened, and you can see what hasn't happened since the crash. We've been eking our way back for 10 years, and we're nowhere near where we were before the crash in terms of American work rates. If we just had the work rates for our nation that we had in 2000, we'd have 8 million more Americans with jobs today. Just think of how different our country would be. So part of this is a problem for America's women. Part of this is a problem for America's men. And the part which concerns America's men is absolutely alarming. I'm going to show you something. This is from last month's job report. We don't have the absolutely latest figures yet. I guess we get those tomorrow, but it's close enough. If you look at the work rate for guys between the ages of 25 and 54, the so-called prime age men, it's just a smidgen. It's just a smidgen higher than in 1939, as reported in our 1940 population census. It is depression scale. And if you look at guys 20 to 64, a broader range of working age guys, it's actually a little bit lower than it was in 1939. So when I say we have a depression scale problem on our hands still today for working men, this is not fake news. Back then, in 1939, there were really only 2 work statuses for working age guys. You either had a job or you were looking for one, you were unemployed. We have a new world now where there's a new option, and that's being checked out of the workforce altogether. Neither working nor looking for work, NILF. That's the blue line that you see here, which has been steadily increasing for half a century. It's taken a little pause recently, but only a little pause. What continues is the disparity that's growing between unemployed and NILF numbers for working age men. For every guy in this prime age group now who's out of work and looking for a job, there are 4. There are 4 who are neither working nor looking for work, checked out of the workforce altogether. That is our crisis. That is our crisis. When I wrote my book 3 years ago, there was some argument about whether there was enough work around for the men, the 7 million guys who were neither working nor looking for work in this age group. I think we can answer this problem pretty definitively now. Of course, there is a structural problem. Of course, there is a certain demand side problem. But if we look at what's happened in the last 10 years, we have a much better, and I'm afraid a much more grim picture of the dilemma before us. Since the end of the crash, the number of guys, prime age guys, neither working nor looking for work has practically not budged. It stayed around 7 million. Over that same period of time, the number of unfilled positions in the United States has tripled. It has jumped by more than 5 million. And there are now more unfilled positions in the United States than there are guys on the couch. And it isn't, by the way, as if all of these unfilled positions are for chemical engineers and computer coders and hedge fund managers. Millions of these jobs do not require higher training, higher degrees, higher education. So what's going on? One of the hints to what's going on can be seen from time use surveys. What guys say they are doing from the moment they wake up in the morning till the moment they go to sleep at night. And the men who are checked out of the labor force report that they basically do not do civil society. Worship is low, volunteering is low, charitable activity is very low. They do not help out much around the household. What they do is watch. They watch videos, DVDs, television, other things at home. About 2,100 hours per guy per year in this group of unworking men. And when we learn from other sources that about half of these unworking men report that they are taking pain medication every day, we get more of a sense of the social tragedy that we are facing. It's not just playing World of Warcraft, it's playing World of Warcraft stoned. And this is part of the opioid catastrophe, which has also visited our country. Part, I think, of what we have to deal with here is the unintended consequences of well-meaning programs, including our disability insurance programs. We do not have a single comprehensive data source for the many different programs of disability which people can draw benefits from. But the closest that I could find was this particular source, which I show here. It's a few years old, we're looking in the rearview mirror, but a few years ago, over half of the guys who were checked out of the workforce in this prime age group were obtaining one or more benefits from some disability program, and 2/3 lived in homes that were obtaining at least one benefit. I'm certainly not saying that disability programs have created this problem, but disability programs manifestly are financing this lifestyle. There's another invisible problem that Uncle Sam has overlooked, and this is the explosion of XCOM population in our nation. We know about mass incarceration, but we don't have any statistics about what happens to people when they are released, or what happens to people after they are sentenced. Some intrepid demographers have tried to estimate the size of our felonized population. As of 2010, they estimate it was almost 20 million persons total. If you do a little back of the envelope arithmetic, what you learn is that today we have more than 20 million ex-cons in society as a whole, essentially invisible. That works out to about 1 in 8 adult guys, and the ratio is a little bit higher for prime age men. This is certainly part of the problem, but we have almost no data on it. I'm going to switch right to the end here. This odd little chart is a sort of a summary, but it'll give you a little bit of background on some of the nerdy homework that I've done, because I think it's quite meaningful to what we're talking about today. We can look at the work rates and the labor force participation rates for different subgroups of prime age guys, by ethnicity, by education, by marital status, by family status. What would happen if we had 1965 weightings or population distributions instead of the ones we have today? What if we had today's work and labor force participation rates, but we had 1965 society applying that? Well, if you look at this chart, what it's trying to show you are the following things. First of all, we've had a tremendous surge in education in America over the last half century and more. If we had 1965 level educational profiles for America, the problem would be even worse than it is today. On the other hand, if we had 1965 patterns of marriage, divorce, separation, and the like, we'd have vastly less men out of work, workless men. About 2/3 of that problem would disappear if we had 1965 family structure, illustratively. There's a kid at home factor, we might call the provider factor. Irrespective of whether guys are married or not, if there is a child under the same roof as guys, they are more likely to be in the workforce. They're more likely to have a job. The child at home factor is significant. Immigration has actually seems to raise, not to lower, the employment levels and labor force participation for our country. No group in America is as hardworking as America's immigrants from abroad. And finally, I think maybe perhaps counterintuitively, we know that our society has changed greatly in terms of ethnic and racial demographic composition over the past 50 years. But those changes have had virtually no impact, virtually no net impact on the men without work problem. So that's a red herring. What we have to remember, these numbers I've shown you, is that these men I've been mentioning are our sons, they're our brothers, they're our relatives, they are our neighbors. And we're not going to be a great country until we can make America work again. Thank you and bless you all.
Nick, thank you for that sobering assessment. We are going to invite our panelists to the stage for the next conversation. We have heard a very strong diagnosis of the problem that we're facing. So we're going to have a conversation now about to point towards the solutions that we might consider. Everybody on this panel has an amazing leadership record. It was hard to tell you exactly all about them, so I picked a few things. Sitting next to Nick is Leslie Ford. She is Special Assistant to President Trump for Domestic Policy. She drives policymaking on his agenda for a wide range of welfare and health issues, including an initiative the president has undertaken over the last few years to transform the welfare state and ensure it helps rather than harms those it serves. So she's going to update us on the work that's going on in the administration. We have Eric, who is a senior leader at the Georgia Center for Opportunity. He focuses on helping overcome poverty through innovative tools to help individuals. He also has a wide range of board service in his community with education and sentencing initiatives. Ian is the CEO of Public Prep Charter Schools, which is a network of single-sex elementary and middle public schools that put their students on a path to complete college. He too has served in a wide range of roles, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to MTV, to the White House to Teach for America. So please join me in welcoming them to the conversation. Okay, so we're going to focus on some potential solutions to the diagnosis that Nick shared with us. Ian, over the last couple decades, some researchers have really focused on a potential solution that is often called the success sequence. for avoiding poverty. And we haven't really seen those ideas take hold in the popular awareness, though. I was wondering, could you explain what the elements of the success sequence are and how they're informing your work to ensure people stay out of poverty or grow out of it?
Sure. First of all, thank you. It's an honor to be here this morning to focus on a topic which is of deep import to empowering children to really be able to pursue the American dream. As you said, I do run Public Prep, which is a network of single-gender public charter schools. We have about elementary and middle schools, 5 campuses, about 2,000 students in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. The vast majority of our kids are from low-income communities, and parents have chosen to enter our schools for the hope that we are going to put our kids on a pathway to power. One of the things that's so important about what we try to do with our kids is this idea of developing a sense of personal agency, that there are real barriers in terms of, structural barriers in terms of race, gender, ethnicity. But the point is that you have to, as a child, believe that you, within your own personal decision-making power, have the ability to overcome those ultimate barriers. So probably the best example of how we are leveraging something called the success sequence is that for our graduating 8th graders, we actually have a class called Pathways to Power. And in that class, our 8th graders say, what are our goals over the next 12 years of our life? In high school, college, and the first 4 years of young adulthood. What is it that I'm seeking to accomplish? I want to get a great job. I want to have a good relationship, whatever those goals are. And then what are the impediments? And in this class, what we try to do is say, here are different evidence-based pathways that can provide a guide or, in fact, even a framework for decision-making. And the success sequence is one of the evidence-based pathways that we share. So what is it? For probably most people in this room, it's something that you've organically done in your own lives, and it's something that's got a fancy name, but it's probably something you just organically saw in your own family or in your neighborhood. And the steps are, relatively simply, finishing your high school degree, just that, at least that, full-time work of any kind, just so you learn the dignity, the discipline, the responsibility of work, and then if you have children, marriage first. Those are the steps. The data shows that young people who follow that series of steps in that order, 97% of the time avoid poverty. And 86% of those that follow those steps end up in the middle class or beyond. And if you grow up in a low-income neighborhood, something like only 6% fall into poverty. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. And so we, as a school network, have decided this is critical information that young people need to know, because the institutions through which young people would learn these passages into young adulthood, they may not be seeing organically in their own family if they are being in a fragile family, or if they're in a community with many men who are outside of the labor force, or because religiosity is down, they're not learning it in the faith community. They're not necessarily seeing it in popular media because these aren't necessarily the messages. So in the absence of institutions imparting this information to young people about the passages into adulthood that give them the greatest likelihood of success, it really rests on schools to be, the one institution that has kids for most of the year. So that's why we feel it's so important to impart this information to our kids.
Thank you. Some food for thought there, I think. Eric, could you share with the group here, you're helping make connections to work through a new, really interesting online tool. I'm not sure if it's an app, but could you tell us a bit about what the tool is and your thinking behind it and how it's helping connect people to work again?
Sure. So it's an online platform. It's not really an app, but it's a platform. We call it Hiring Well, Doing Good, which is really part of a larger initiative called Hiring Well, Doing Good, that's all focused on this idea of moving the chronically unemployed back into the workforce through very intentionally working in communities to connect nonprofits that serve the population we're trying to help, connecting them with the businesses who are open to giving essentially a chance to these folks to find jobs, to have jobs. It really came out of work that we did on prisoner reentry reform. In Georgia, we've had a good history now for about 7 or 8 years of criminal justice reform. Prisoner reentry early on was not dealt with like it needed to be. Much to Nick's point, Georgia has a huge population of folks with criminal records. Now, this includes felonies, misdemeanors, arrests, but there are somewhere around 3 million people in Georgia that have something on their criminal history, okay? We have roughly 500,000 people who are under criminal justice supervision in our state. We are one of the worst in the country as far as this goes. So what you see from that is collateral consequences to having a criminal record, which essentially means that the men and women who have criminal records can't find work, right? They're disqualified from work. So we first started through policy initiatives to try to help the state change some of these things that were keeping these individuals from finding work. Things like making it easier to get a driver's license when you come out of prison, especially if you have some drug conviction. Because in Georgia, before the reforms, it was a non-starter for almost a year after you got out to be able to get your driver's license, which meant in Georgia you couldn't work because you couldn't get to work. Allowing people to have greater access to occupational licensing, yet another piece that was really off limits, especially if you had a felony on your record. Even if the license that you were after had nothing to do with the felony that you were convicted of. You just couldn't get work as a plumber, for instance, that sort of thing. And then there were some incentives to employers, tax incentives and limited liability incentives to get employers into the game of trying to give folks a chance. So the work started there, but the thing we asked ourselves was, we have these great policy reforms. It seems like it's the right way to go, but if the community is not ready to absorb, to serve the population, will it really make a difference? And we really didn't think that it would. And we had a history of doing community-based initiatives around marriage and family issues, and we felt like this was a prime topic to take to a community-level initiative. So that's where Hiring Well, Doing Good came together, okay? It was the idea of going into a particular city. At first, it was just our backyard of where our office is located, to get the community galvanized around the idea that it could do something to get people into the workforce. And we've gone to an additional city in Columbus, Georgia, formed a similar working group. And out of that working group of nonprofits and businesses, essentially what came up was that they needed a technology platform, something that would help streamline a lot of the work that they had to do to get these folks into jobs, okay? And it's common sense stuff. You'll go, well, you know, it's not novel, but it's helpful. So the things that the system actually does, one, it allows for a barriers assessment. So when a job seeker is coming into the system, immediately they see a barriers assessment that they work through. And it tells us if they are facing things like a need for housing, a need for transportation, child care, if they're dealing with an addiction issue. Criminal records is a prominently featured piece of the barriers assessment. And then within the system, it actually will connect them to local community service providers, assuming they exist in their community, that are able to fill those gaps and help provide services that deal with that issue, okay? And the system, it has a live referral piece, so we can sort of track whether that referral is being responded to, how long it takes, those sorts of things. And then there's a soft skills survey that actually finds whether the people are work ready, and it identifies places along, you know, their skills where there are gaps, and it then connects them to a curriculum that essentially allows them to take classes online or in the community that help fill those gaps and makes them, you know, more job ready than they were before. And it gives us a chance to sort of certify people ready for work as we do the last piece, which is referring them to local work within their communities that we have matched to both their skills and aptitudes because of the surveying that we do early on. So that's essentially what the platform itself does. We have gone live with the system. We are now testing it in Columbus, Georgia. We have a pilot group working through it now, helping us to refine what we're doing and working out kinks. in the system, and by spring we hope to go live and be in additional cities. We're already talking to other states and other cities that are interested in the platform.
It's an incredibly personal intervention, matching the unique challenges that someone faces with unique solutions
Yes.
to help them transition. That's incredible. Sort of switching from these two very on the ground viewpoints to a very 30,000-foot viewpoint. Leslie, government policy can either get in the way or can support these kinds of changes. In your role at the White House, you've been spending the greater part of the year trying to move things in the right direction. Could you sort of tell us a bit about the framework the Trump administration is bringing to this question and some of the steps that it's taking to advance it?
So this has been ongoing for President Trump since the campaign, but it really took form and substance. Last year, April 2018, he signed an executive order. It's reducing poverty in America by promoting opportunity and economic mobility. And in that EO, he spelled out, what do we mean? What are the principles of economic mobility? And he charged all the secretaries who were in charge of overseeing what we call income maintenance programs or anti-poverty programs to really apply these principles to the programs that they oversee. So actually yesterday, we finalized a regulation. It takes that long. We finalized a regulation in SNAP and food stamps. And so what it does is it's long-standing statute, well over 20 years, has said that able-bodied adults without dependents, normally the type of men that Nick was talking about earlier, they should at least work or look for work, train for work. They can even volunteer 6 hours a week in order to qualify for food stamps. You can be on the program for 3 months, but then after that, we expect you to look for work. Unfortunately, how this long-standing statute has been applied has been through waivers. I think every state had a waiver during the recession, which may have been understandable then. But when President Trump came into office, and even until last year, there are 34 states with waivers. 74% of the 3.1 million able-bodied men on the program were not working. We're not subject to the work requirements at all. And that's a real travesty. I think it contributes to the problem that Nick was talking about earlier. If you are able to subsist at a very low level, either through disability benefits, as Nick mentioned, or through SNAP benefits, or through any other benefits that the federal government offers, you are never going to encounter the dignity of work. So the regulation that we proposed limits the waivers that states are able to apply for, so that it really is just in situations where there's a lack of sufficient jobs, which in this economy, when we have a 3.6 unemployment rate, should be very far and in between, few in between. And I know there are a lot of state DHS secretaries here, so I kind of want to go into some of the technical details that you may not have seen in some of the articles yesterday, and I apologize if I bore you here. So one of the ways that states were able to get a waiver is if their unemployment rate in the area they were seeking a waiver for was 20% above the national average. And when you're in the middle of a recession, that makes sense. But ironically, the better the economy does, the easier it is to get a waiver. So we said, all right, you have to have a base 6% unemployment rate. That was the biggest change that we made. Secondly, states would define the area in their state haphazardly, or I'm going to say haphazardly. So they would have a county up here and a county down here, and whatever math turned out to have the largest waiver in the state, that is how they would combine random counties together. So we said that doesn't make a lot of sense. We now are switching to a labor market area. This is defined by the Department of Labor, and it is defined specifically so that if you can find a job in your local community, if you can drive to that job without changing your place of residence, you should look for that job. So we defined area very specifically. We made a couple other changes, but those are the main ones, so that we're truly looking at a lack of sufficient jobs in the area. And if you don't have a lack of sufficient jobs, we expect able-bodied adults, no disabilities, they're aged 19 to 50, not even above 50. They aren't caring for any dependents. We're talking children here, or they're caregiver for someone with a disability. Really prime age individuals they should work, they should look for work. So that's what we did yesterday.
We've heard a sampling just now of initiatives that are being done to help people reconnect with the workforce. I'm sure if we went around the room, there's so many people here who are also working on that. So it's just a sampling. But Nick, are there, in your view, given your deep dive into the problem, are there other initiatives that we should be thinking about or gaps that need to be filled as we reflect, to help us reflect on ways we might pursue new opportunities or challenges?
Well, there are a lot of things that the government can't do. I can't prove this to you, but I'm pretty sure that the decline in faith in the United States is directly related to some of the misery that we're describing here. I wouldn't want to see a Department of Religion set up across the mall. I think we know what would happen if we tried that. There are things which we need to do as citizens and as family members, as parishioners, that we don't want to ask Washington or our state governments or local governments to get into. But two things I think we could ask Uncle Sam to start thinking about. One would be a wholesale reform of our disability archipelago. I think, and it's easy for me as a researcher to say this because I don't have to operationalize it, but as a concept, I think we need to have a work-first principle in our disability programs. They're made for people who can't work, and they should be there for people who can't work. But in practice today, they all too often have the consequence of enabling dependence and helplessness for people who don't have to be helpless and dependent, and that contributes to our pool of national misery. Easier said than done, but something to look at. The other glaring thing that I see, and you mentioned this, is the enormous invisible population of ex-cons in our country. I find it absolutely scandalous that we, as an information-friendly society, if we had the first high-tech data-driven initiative built into our Constitution back in the 1700s, the National Population Census. I find it scandalous that we are not more curious about the 20 million brothers and sisters who have a criminal record in their past and are disadvantaged in reentry because of this. We can't have evidence-based policies unless we have the evidence, and it would not be hard to develop that evidence. We could develop that evidence very quickly if we only cared enough about our brothers and sisters there.
Those are really thoughtful observations. Sort of zooming back around a bit to the practitioner perspective who's struggling within the environment we have. Share with us a bit more. You clearly have been a leader in education areas, thought deeply about it. What do you think are the most important aspects that we could contribute in the education space to help people reconnect with work, overcome poverty?
Yep. So, something Nick just said is very important, that, government policy is important, but there's only, it can't be the full universe of solutions. And as someone who runs schools, a big part of what we think about is, what are we teaching the next generation? So we avoid all of these issues in the first place. Like, what are the norms, what are the behaviors, what are the skill sets that they need to learn at a young age so that the decisions that they make put them in a completely different set of opportunities or challenges. So work is obviously a critical component, but work really is only one element of a meaningful life. I mean, that chart that Nick showed that if we had the same marriage rates of 1965, you saw the huge increase in employment and the huge decrease in the men who are not even looking for work. And so that's why, again, the elements of the success sequence, I think, are so powerful because it provides a roadmap. Now, again, it's non-prescriptive in the sense that in our classrooms, we don't say, this is what you must do. However, it is descriptive. And in the absence of learning this information from any other institution, it's really important for kids to know that there are some pathways that have greater likelihood for economic success versus others, and that there are rewards or consequences. And it would be a crime, and to some degree almost irresponsible, for us to deprive kids of this information that education, work, marriage, then children is a pathway that you should at least know about in terms of your own life decision making.
Wow. You know, it's interesting. I think each of you have sort of in your own way touched a bit on, you know, we need to focus on work, and then there are pieces beyond work, right? And so I think Jennifer was talking about, or alluding to this notion of reweaving social fabric that has frayed, that have put children in a place where they need to come to school because they can't see in their community. You know, Eric, a lot of what you're talking about, it's also beyond just that individual focus. It is reweaving that fabric, you know, by bringing together the various parts of the community that aren't talking to each other and need to, in order for us to at least in your community, and for us across the nation to think about how we might step forward. So what is the reaction of the people, the employers have to buy in, right? So what's the reaction community-wide to this? What's the reaction to the employers who have to buy in, to the people beyond that who support the employer community?
Sure. Well, I mean, we're working with a diverse group. We're working with nonprofits, businesses, and local leaders. They could be in local government. So there's a mixed reaction, right? The nonprofits are already providing services to this population largely. So they are excited about the help, right? Very interested in trying to take part. Skeptical because things like this have been tried before, and they've been burned at times because it didn't work out. So we see that. We see a lot of business owners who are skeptical initially, who come around once they hear from colleagues who have tried to give individuals who've been chronically unemployed, especially those with criminal records, a chance, and they find out that many times the people with criminal records are often the hardest workers, most loyal employees that they have, because they have a lot to prove and a lot to make up for, right? And they know that. So I think, generally speaking, we find a pool of people who are willing to work with us when we get into a community, because they understand that we're dealing with such a large population of folks. Oftentimes they present as homeless or have some other issue, but as you dig, you find that they are dealing with criminal records issues that have basically locked them out of the workforce. So they are excited that somebody is there with a new idea or some approach that offers a solution. So it's positive from that front. And I think once you get into a community and you start getting some traction, others come along, right? They see that it's working, or they don't want to be left out, and that helps to bring others along. I'll say this though, Howard Husock has a book out now, Who Killed Civil Society? And I love the book. Been reading it over the last few weeks, and I've talked to Howard about it once, and he said the title of the book doesn't reflect his view of what has actually happened necessarily. He's not as pessimistic, I would say, as the title suggests. There are pockets of things that make him hopeful. But if you read his book, really what he focuses on throughout the entire book are stories of relationships between people, right? Someone with a need connected with someone who is willing to help, who is showing love for that person, and offering a hand up. And I think if we're doing anything here, and I think we think of our work at Georgia Center for Opportunity this way, we are all about rebuilding those relationships and reconnecting people in a way that allows them to help one another and encourages them to do that. And it's sort of kumbaya-ish, if you, in a way, and I don't mean for it to sound that way. But if we are to rebuild civil society, we have to understand that civil society is only relationships lived out over time. And I say only when it's the most meaningful thing that we can be engaged in, right? So that's what I see in our work. And that's where effective compassion happens, is at the community level. I agree, the government has much that it can do to remove barriers to folks working together, forming community. Anything the government's doing that prevents healthy relationships from being formed or discourages it, whether it's in the welfare system or our adoption system, fostering, we have to get rid of all those impediments. So I'll finish with saying this, that we had an example of this in Columbus. Before we launched our platform, we actually ran a few pilot groups through a sort of pen and paper version of our platform, right? And at the end, we had really good success, I think. More than half of our folks were placed in jobs at the end, which was great. It's a small sample, but we were happy with that. But we got the feedback of one of our participants, her name was Raquel, and she said in her feedback, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially she said, it was the relationships that this program and this process helped me build that provided me with the hope, the encouragement, and the resources that I needed to finally get a job. The job was at the end of it, but the mechanism, the actual thing that worked, were the relationships with the people who cared about her and would extend their own credibility and give her a hand towards what she actually was after, which was a job. So
it's interesting because when you have this sort of level of it sounds to me like there are people who are eager to overcome and move back into the workforce if given the platform and we're seeing it from children who are eager and their parents who are eager for them. We're seeing them, the groups that you're working with, and we see that there is a desire, if they can see a path forward on the employer community and the others who need to help facilitate that back in. I'm wondering, Nick, those are good signs. And they sort of suggest that there is something that, if properly shepherded, can emerge to address some of the problems that you were diagnosing earlier. Do you have the confidence, or do you have any sense of concern that that there may be a diminished view that work actually does matter for having a meaningful life, particularly among the men that you've been assessing?
Well, I think the historical record is pretty clear. I mean, I think for centuries or maybe millennia, work has been central to a meaningful life. That's why it's called a vocation. It's not just a paycheck. It has so many multipliers and so many spillovers. That reality or that truth hasn't changed in the 21st century. What we see today, and I think part of the epicenter of the misery of the wound in our society today, is that millions of people are separated from that truth. And I think that part of our job as policy types and researchers is to try to do our best to reconnect people with that truth. Because that is a truth that'll set you free.
Pointing the path.
Yeah. And it's interesting, all these things are entangled, right? Because part of the reason work was so central to a meaningful life and dignity was that you were raised, you were preparing to support your family, right? And so when you've got now disconnects in which family dissolution is the norm, then you lose the incentives for work, so it's all this tangle, which again, for the next generation, understanding this series of life decisions and the order in which you make them is so important for at least kids to know, so that when they're making those critical decisions about their education, their work, the timing of family formation, they have a context in which they can see what the rewards or consequences would be.
And in many faith traditions, going back thousands of years, idleness is seen as a source of scandal. Not only something that can poison you, but something that can poison your family and others in your neighborhood. So.
Yeah, it's if we take seriously some of what you were talking about earlier, this is the challenge of our time, and it strikes me as perhaps not as well known as it could be. Leslie, you you're in the trenches. You're trying to I think, pull on the various strings of government to try to put this in the center. And it is much bigger than the niche issue you were talking about. Everybody here keeps kind of pulling these different threads. Could you give us a sense of how the administration is thinking about this globally, and what to what extent are they trying to tackle this problem, and perhaps where are some points that you're looking forward towards additional challenges that need to be addressed?
I think first, just to start, I think we completely acknowledge the federal government can't replace at all either the faith community or the local community. It just can't. And so, but I do think there are two ways we can assist, or at least in the time that we have, we can assist. One is just to remove the barriers from faith-based groups to stepping forward into that void. So I'll point out two that we've undertaken. One is in the adoption space. On November 1st, we put out a proposed rule that would ensure that faith-based communities have a role to receive our grants, that they are not prohibited from contracting or licensing. On the final days of the Obama administration, they put out a reg that would have prohibited many faith-based groups from participating in, for instance, foster care. And so we rolled that back, saying there shouldn't be a barrier here, that everyone should be at the table to assisting in whether it's foster care or whether it's getting people back to work. Another item that we see often is when we do have a program like SNAP or TANF or any of these low-income focused programs, that oftentimes the bridge back to work is just filled by a government, even a state government employee. And that really isn't, it shouldn't be limited to that when we have a state or local official who sees someone who is a SNAP beneficiary, TANF beneficiary, they should be reaching out into their communities. It shouldn't just be limited to the government. They should be able to contract with, oh, there's a Goodwill over here, that's a perfect job. Or they should go out to their faith-based communities. Why don't you partner to have that long-term relationship to get someone back into the workforce, or get them transportation, or provide childcare, whatever those supports need to be. So we've put out a lot of letters saying there is no government prohibition. There's no federal government rule saying you only use government employees to get people back to work. The most effective programs are actually the local programs. So removing the barriers is part of it. Some of the part of it is using the bully pulpit to be saying that marriage is important, to be saying constantly that work is dignified and it's essential to the human person. And so we do that in a number of ways. One is just the EO I mentioned. Another is focusing on apprenticeships, that we're not just looking at E&T programs, but we're going out and saying, no, it's good to work while you're learning new skills. One of the things I do want to point out is the First Step Act. And immediately after the president signed the First Step Act, which deals with the federal prison system, we started looking at, no, we actually need to make sure that we have second chances for the people who are coming out of prison. The First Step Act didn't just deal with mandatory minimums. It also said, if you're in prison, you should be in prison actually near your local community so you don't lose those ties while you're serving your time. And while you're in prison, you should have access to substance abuse treatments, that you should have access to training programs, that you should have access to education, so that when you exit prison, there is a pathway back for you to your family and to the workforce. So those are just some of the things, removing barriers, using the bully pulpit, that we can assist here.
So, one thing that you brought up, I just want to comment on, is the tie to local community for prisoners coming back. Mm-hmm. That often is not the best place for them to go. And I think whatever flexibility or direction that can be given that says there needs to be individual assessment of where these individuals would be best placed after they come out would be a preferable approach. Oftentimes the worst place is back in the community where they came from, back with the folks who helped create
I should
the
clarify. I meant that when they're in prison, they're not 3,000 miles away from their family members.
Yep.
It doesn't mean
That's
that
good.
once they leave prison that they're going to be placed back in the same exact location that they came from.
Good.
Yeah,
Great.
clear.
Thank you.
So I felt incredibly sober when I heard Nick's analysis this morning, and I felt glimmers of hope listening to the three of you, really. To what extent do you, from your perspective where we are, to what extent do you think we're making strides in emphasizing, at a minimum, the dignity of work towards, the importance of work towards having a meaningful life, and the other many factors you've identified as well. To what extent do you feel that that message has gotten out as a reason that policy should change? And if you're seeing barriers to connecting, where are you finding those points of friction?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think always optimism, and again, I run schools, so I deal with young people every day, so there's an inherent optimism, and we just have to sort of guide kids to be able to be good decision makers. I mean, I think sometimes the challenge, or certainly challenges that we've faced, even in implementing this class, Pathways to Power, is that there's a lot of emphasis on the reasons that kids are not succeeding, or why certain communities are sort of perpetually in poverty, and there's structural barriers around race and class and gender. And so there's a lot of attention on sort of the institutional barriers. And so when we say, okay, true, but what are the tools that kids will have in their own arsenal? Those are the factors that they control that could, ironically, be the best tools to overcome these real barriers. Sometimes there's a tension, actually, in wanting to focus on this, because it's almost as, well, if we start talking about that, then you're introducing the ideas of individual responsibility and personal choice, and that goes against the narrative that there are these real barriers, that should be the 100% focus. And I think that's a real tension that we've got to get over, that both things can be true at the same time. And especially when we're speaking to young people, we don't want such a focus on the structural barriers to get to the point where you feel that you're essentially powerless to overcome these challenges in your own life. So hence for us, that's why we've got to build this inherent optimism, capitalize on it, and build a sense of personal agency in kids in particular.
Yeah, I mean, that's inherently the idea of resiliency, right? Like, life is going to serve you stuff we don't really want to go through.
Right, how are you going to deal with it?
Right.
And by the way, there's structural racism, there's also disease and accident. There's all sorts of things that will come in your life's way, but how are you equipped, both mentally and with the information, to surround yourself in a community of people that can support you, and then ultimately make good decisions for your own life?
So sort of a realistic hopefulness, if you will.
Yeah, it's just pragmatic. And this is where social norms are just so important, right? Because if you see enough examples of the sort of the generally acceptable path, you're like, okay, I can rely on those. Like but if in the absence of those, or frankly, in the absence of, well, in the face of social norms that are not reinforcing of good decisions, that is equally as bad. So we can't be passive. We actually have to assert that there are certain series of decisions that have a greater likelihood of success than others, and the next generation needs to know that.
Wow, that is the challenge.
So this question of dignity of work, I think the people in this room, obviously, I know a lot of you, you speak to this very well, and I applaud you for that. I've also been heartened by somebody, Micro. You guys know Micro from Dirty Jobs. I mean, it's been phenomenal. I know maybe his influence is waning a bit, but just this idea that this man who talks about doing just blue-collar, nasty jobs, raising the profile of the dignity of any kind of work, right, can get the attention that he has had, and to be as articulate a spokesperson for that view as he has been phenomenal. And I think popular culture-wise, the message has gotten out there. I do wonder, though, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but when we're talking about the dignity of work, sometimes I think we're saying dignity of certain types of work, and not dignity of all kinds of work. And we send that message in subtle ways. If we think about how our public schools are structured, we don't prepare kids who aren't college-bound to go to work after school as if it's a shameful thing. Struggles with my own children who, I've got one that struggles a little bit in school, and I talk to him about, hey, plumbing is a great profession. You can make a lot of money at that, and you'd be satisfied working with your hands, Talk to him about those things. Our criminal justice system, which locks people out of opportunity. I just wonder if we have systemic things that are happening and attitudes that are pervasive that we don't actually deal with, whether it's in the school system, criminal justice system, that undermine the talk of dignity of work. And I think restructuring, having a new attitude, asking yourself, how do you treat the waiter at the restaurant that you go to? Do you talk to your Uber driver as they're taking you around? What do you think of them, really? What do you really think of them? I think it's a personal thing in some ways, and we have to show the dignity that we say we believe in as we're interacting with folks. And I'll stop with this bit, and it's yesterday I had 2 drivers, both women from Ethiopia, driving Uber cars, right? And one lady was just amazing. She was super smart, super intelligent, had lots of things to say. We're just small talk at first. But at one point she said, I just want you to know that America is the land of opportunity. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, well, why do you say so? And she said, well, my family, we came here, and she was talking about sort of the jobs that they started out doing, you know, cleaning commercial buildings and things like that. It's really what they could get. And sort of working her way and her family's way up. And she said, you know, when we first got here, lots of people crammed in a single bedroom apartment, and we could barely afford that. But now we're in a house. And she said, look around. I am driving an Uber car. She said, in my country of Ethiopia, women can't do this. I said, well, what can you do? She said, I can raise kids. I said, but that's it, right? She said, but now I'm doing this. And I'm telling my 18-year-old son that there is no job beneath him, that whatever it takes to make it, you can do it here. And I think, to your point on the immigrant population, they have a handle on what it means to feel dignified in whatever work you can get, right? We have the luxury, as not being recent immigrants and having suffered through what those folks have dealt with, to sort of take it for granted. And I think, you know, we've passed that attitude on to our kids, unfortunately. If we can get back to them appreciating the amazing country that we have and the opportunities that it offers through the eyes of our immigrant population, maybe telling their stories more. I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing. Maybe that's a way we can get back to this attitude and true understanding of dignity of work, like this lady had. So.
Build on something that Ian said. I do a lot of work with statistics and social probabilities, but it's absolutely clear from my homework that we are not victims of social probabilities. Workforce outcomes are not set by some probability function that is immutable. If we look at, for example, married African American men, and we compared them to never married Anglos, guess who's got the higher work rate and labor force participation rate? Always, right? If we look at high school dropouts who were born abroad, guess who has the labor force participation rate of college-educated native-born Americans, right? There are things that we can do, decisions we can make that will help to determine outcomes that are outside of the social probabilities. And that's what I think is so important about this anti-poverty forum. Because one of the very positive things which has happened in recent years is we have redefined and reconceptualized what anti-poverty policy and approaches should be. It's not something that will be solved by the redistribution commissars. It will never be solved by the redistribution commissars. It will be solved by approaches that bring people out of dependence and into independence and into generating their own personal prosperity. And to the extent that we can contribute to that, I think we're really, we're in consonance with our American founders, and we're in consonance with the American dream.
Well, on that note, we have time, I think, for a couple of questions from the audience. I am wondering, I see a hand right here. Yes, please. I think the mic is coming around.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about the dignity of work, because you know there's an old saying that a man with one watch knows what time it is. A man with two watches is not so sure. Similarly, a person who knows one way to live knows how to live. And most people here know how to live because they know one way to live. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, predicted that by now people would be working 15 hours a week. And he explained it would be 15 hours a week because, and I'm quoting here, we have been trained too long to strive and not to enjoy. The American way of living, where you work 40 hours a week, is not the only way of life. It's not even a very good way of life. I realize conservatives strive to conserve, but with technology and all that, in 20 years, there probably won't be a single job that can't be done better by a machine than by a person. And the times, they are changing. My question is anybody willing to consider alternatives?
Nick, please.
That essay, the economic consequences for our grandchildren. It's a wonderful essay, and Keynes is a fantastic creative thinker. I don't think that even John Maynard Keynes, however, could have imagined our world today, almost a century later, where we have one group of people who are working 2,200 or 2,400 hours a year, and another huge group that are working none at all. I mean, this is something which he couldn't have imagined, and he regarded the freeing up of population for higher pursuits as the objective that would come out of more free time. Free time is clearly a luxury good. That's why richer populations always generally have more free time. But there's a difference between using your free time for higher pursuits and using your free time for things which turn out to be degrading. And that's where we see the opioid crisis. I mean, this is not all free time is created the same. That's my point.
See a question in the front.
Hi, I'm Melissa Ortiz, and I am the person in the room who addresses disability from right of center because I believe in the dignity of work for people who are work capable and not just those who are able-bodied. That's right. Nicholas, kudos to you for saying what I've been screaming for years about, that the disability programs are enabling this. My question for all of you is, what are you doing in this space? Because my research shows that fully 2/3 of people in the criminal justice system have some sort of intellectual or developmental disability, and it has to be addressed if they're going to be successful coming back into the community. And then from a policy standpoint, we need to tear apart the disability programs, and instead of making them a hammock, make them a safety net, as they were intended to be. Here's a very personal example. The year that my husband and I got married, I had to have major surgery where they rebuilt my bladder bowel system, and I was in the bed for 3 months, and the social worker came to see us, and she goes, I need to tell you that you need to get a divorce. You can live together all you want to, you can have as much sex, you can go on trips, you can do whatever you want to, but you have to get a divorce on paper because we can't give you any benefits. And y'all, that kills the heart of marriage and work in our families. And we didn't do it, and we struggled, and we still struggle because of that one requirement. And so I'd love to know what the president's thoughts are, and what, I know, Leslie, you can't speak for the president, but what are we going to do to bring more people with disabilities into the conservative movement? Their fear is, when you start talking about reforms, is that they're going to be cut out. Their legs are going to be cut out from under them. So what are we going to do to message it better? And what are we going to do to build bridges to fully bring in people with disabilities to work and have that dignity, which is so incredible?
Yeah, I think everything you said is absolutely correct. I can speak to the disability program. For instance, the vocational grid, how we determine whether people with disability are actually able to participate in our economy, it hasn't been updated in 40 years. So that's obviously something we're looking at, 40 years. And the economy's changed just a little bit since then. So looking at people with disabilities as though they are work capable and having a different measure. Right now it's kind of a ratchet. You're either work capable or you're not. There's no sliding scale for them. I think also what you pointed out about marriage comes into all of our conversations today. Almost every low-income program, every income maintenance program we look at penalizes marriage. EITC is a perfect example of that. And that's something we can look at in the administration. It's also something for Congress to look at because oftentimes it's built into our statutes. So I think those are two examples.
Well, thank you.
I mean, it's also fascinating that someone would feel so comfortable. Like, imagine to be able to say something like that and with impunity, with that you have to get divorced. Imagine that means that that person has been socialized and accepted, that is valid recommendation for someone who's going through what you were going through. And that to me, in some ways, is scarier, the fact that they were so part of an accepted culture.
I hate to say it, the neighborhood I grew up in, which was once beautiful, it's a ghetto now. Seems like poverty is kind of like a really mean disease. It just kind of slowly creeps and consumes, and it's just spreading.
Everybody has a story. It could be through drugs, it could be through abuse, it could be through violence. And our families are broken down, our communities are broken down, people's lives are broken down, they're devastated.
This is the story of 3 forgotten American cities. I spent 5 years exploring this lost American interior. I thought I'd be telling an economic story, but over time I discovered there's a deeper human crisis.
My dad is in jail in Texas right now, and he's been there for about 2 years. Somebody that you really love goes away. It's like a piece of your heart missing.
Man, it's really hit home for me, man. You know what I'm saying? I tell people all the time, man, that man, my mama raised 3 boys, man. Man, and both of my brothers were killed, man. And man, my brothers were my friends, man.
If I didn't have a family, I wouldn't be alive right now. The only thing that keeps my heart beating, the only thing that keeps my old heart from giving up on me is knowing that I have a reason why to keep breathing in and out and moving forward.
Bring peace to this neighborhood. Bring salvation to this neighborhood.
Change starts with us. If we can affect a person, we can affect the community, we can affect the city, we can affect the world.
Well, that was a wonderful first panel, and we're going to continue the rich conversation. We have a wonderful group of people who are going to bring both the policy and the practitioner perspectives to us once again. Julie Baumgartner is the president of First Things First, a grassroots organization that is dedicated to strengthening families in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but it really has reach across the nation and is an example to many who are working in the fields of relationship and marriage education. And Julie is a nationally recognized leader in that field, so we're so grateful she would take time to be with us today. Chris Rufo is a research fellow at the Discovery Institute. You just saw the trailer to his documentary, America Lost, which tells the story of families struggling for survival in 3 forgotten American cities. He's a documentary filmmaker and has directed 4 documentaries for PBS, so very glad to have him with us. And Sharpelle Welch is a community coordinator at Community Renewal International, where she runs a friendship house with her husband, Emmett. We're so glad Emmett can be here today, too. Community Renewal is a faith-based nonprofit in Shreveport, Louisiana, that works to restore the foundation of safe and caring communities. Sharpelle is an Army veteran, and she's a 2019 Civil Society Fellow at the Manhattan Institute as well. And my colleague, Robert Rector, at the Heritage Foundation, is a leading national authority on welfare and poverty issues. One of the important contributions that his groundbreaking research has made over the years is to show the connection between the collapse of marriage and poverty and how it undermines human well-being generally. So we are really thankful for this panel to be together. Please join me in welcoming them, and I'm going to join them here and have a conversation. So Chris, I'd actually like to begin with you. We just saw your trailer, and you set out to tell one story, and it ended up very different. Can you just walk us through kind of your evolution in thinking?
That always happens. You know, as a documentary filmmaker, there's a great saying that if you end up making the film you set out to make, you're doing something wrong. And for this film, I think I approached the subject. I had done some research trips. I decided to film in these three kind of struggling American cities: Youngstown, Ohio, Memphis, Tennessee, and Stockton, California, that broadly represent the geographic and racial composition of the United States. And I set out with the frame that probably a lot of us in this room have, is I'm looking at the issue of poverty, so I'm thinking first and foremost about economics and public policy. And then as I spent more and more time on the ground meeting people, really getting to know the inner workings of these communities and following people in their daily lives, I realized that I had it totally upside down. We have kind of an academic bias, maybe through education, where we look at things and if you think about it, very abstractly, right? Economics, public policy, it's very abstract. But actually life is lived in a tangible way, in a human way. And I realized that I was looking at the problem all wrong, that policy and economy are essential and important, but really they only grasp almost a surface level of the experience in these places. So I really changed the orientation of the film, and my own personal orientation is trying to look at this phenomenon in a human way. And really not saying, well, what is important from my perspective as someone influencing the public policy debate or the culture, media, but actually from their perspective. What's important in their lives? What are those essential human qualities? And I ended up actually, it took a little bit longer. Some of my funders were a little bit upset, but I explained to them, this is actually a much more difficult film to make. It's not that you go in, you film a couple stories, you talk to some experts, and you're done. But really trying to understand the fundamental building blocks of meaning in people's lives. And in a way, I learned a tremendous amount spending time with these families, because in a poor community like Memphis or Stockton or Youngstown, you don't have all of the opportunities, you don't have all of the things that kind of smooth out life experience that you might have in a more prosperous place. And then you become very reliant on those fundamental building blocks. And in a way, I think that that's how I think the debate could be changed and framed differently, is rather than looking at it from the top down, which is how we've been looking at it since, really exclusively for the last 50 years, but looking at it from the inside out. And looking at it through the lens of people's real human experience. What's important to them? And it turns out to be a lot of the things we talked about on the panel: family, religious conviction, community, work. And you can really see it in very stark terms. And I ended up, in one way, some of these communities are very difficult. You can see in the imagery, it's shocking that these are American cities. But I ended up feeling kind of depressed about the places, but inspired by the people. And I think that's really where we need to start, is with those people.
Well said, and a great start to laying the thesis of this panel as well, so thank you. I'm struck by the curiosity with which you undertake filmmaking, and I know as a researcher, Robert tackles data with that same sort of curiosity. So I want to ask you, Robert, to just kind of in a parallel track, lay the groundwork of the data for this conversation. What does the data say about marriage in relation to human well-being?
Well, to start out with, the decline in marriage is the #1 factor in child poverty in the United States today. When Lyndon Johnson started the war on poverty, 7% of children in the United States were born outside of marriage. Today, it's 42%. And the overwhelming bulk of child poverty is occurring in the single parent or families. Marriage, generally holding other factors constant, is going to reduce the probability that a child will be poor by 66 to 75%. But that's the modest problem, because in reality, marriage has much more effect and power on all the other variables beyond economics. And so if you look at any variable from asthma to suicide, it's dramatically reduced by the presence of marriage. Roz Chetty at Harvard did a study a couple years ago that found that the presence of marriage in a community was the #1 factor in predicting upward child mobility of all children in the neighborhoods. Crime, a child being raised in a family without a father holding economics constant is twice as likely to be engaged in crime and end up in jail as a young adult. And then an adult male, if he is not married, is probably 50% more likely to continue in crime. Marriage is a preventative to adult crime. Every factor, we have a lot of things about opioid crisis today. Well, the opioid crisis occurs among non-married, middle-educated men. A non-married, middle-educated man is 30 times more likely to die from an opioid overdose compared to a married, college-educated man. Every factor you could look at, marriage, including human happiness. There was one very, very widely cited study that showed that being married had the same effect of increasing human happiness as adding $100,000 to the family income. All of these factors are so important, not only for the child, but also for the adults. And we can talk about, for example, the decline in labor force participation. The decline in labor force participation is occurring among non-married men for the obvious reason. I mean, social science really just always comes back to common sense. If a man is not married, he has so much less reason to work hard, to stay in the labor force, to commit to career improvement and so forth. Earning that money for the family is what motivates men. If men do not have marriage, don't have children that they're supporting, guess what? They work a whole lot less. And Brad Wilcox and Robert Lehrman just put out a study last year showing that the decline in male labor force participation due to the decline in marriage seemed to be causing a loss to the economy of about $1 trillion a year. That's the #1 factor behind this labor force decline. It does not occur among married men. It occurs among men that are separated from their families and really don't have a role in our society anymore. And the very first thing we should do about this as a society is not do any harm. We shouldn't have policies that transparently discriminate against marriage and penalize it, but that is in fact the heart of the entire welfare system.
Very good, thank you. Sharpelle, I want to turn to you, and we're now zooming right down to interpersonal relationships, very, very face-to-face. And will you tell us about the work at the Friendship House and the challenge that it stood up to face?
Absolutely. So I am from a neighborhood called Allendale in Shreveport, Louisiana. As recent as 15 years ago, Allendale was one of the worst places to live. We fell on the wrong side of every socioeconomic statistic you can name. We had, my husband and I moved into the neighborhood. We work for an organization called Community Renewal International, and what they do is they will plant married couples in high crime, high poverty, high risk neighborhoods, and we begin to work to rebuild the relational fabric of that neighborhood from within the neighborhood. So I'm not coming in as another big government program to make promises I can't keep. I am your neighbor. Your plight is my plight. And we are co-workers with our neighbors. And we begin to just change the mindset one neighbor at a time about how we can make our neighborhoods better. And I think marriage is a big part of that. There is no absence of fathers in our neighborhood. There is no absence of men in our neighborhood. There's a huge deficit of husbands in our neighborhood. In a 30 to 40 block radius from where Emmett and I live, we are one of 3 married couples of thousands of homes. And so that's a problem. That's a problem. And that's one that we are tackling strategically through a 3-tiered model, through community renewal. And it's all about connecting people, rebuilding those relationships, having mutually enhancing positive relationships, because there is no absence of relationships, right? They are the wrong kind of connections that our kids are making today. And we're trying to replace that with positive connections in order to change the mindset, change the trajectory of these kids before they reach the prison system, so that they can be viable working adults.
Wonderful, and an amazing model that I'm so eager to hear more about as you share with us. Thank you. Julie, I wanted to turn to you, and First Things First has a 20-year track record, and tell us more about the problems it was created to face, and how those have changed. Have those changed over time, and if so, how?
Interesting. We were started in 1997 by a group of businessmen, and they had conducted research and found that Chattanooga, Hamilton County, had a divorce rate 50% higher than the national average. 50% of the births in the city and 39% of the births in the county were out of wedlock. And based on those two statistics in terms of divorce and out of wedlock births, we also had a very high rate of fatherlessness. And so First Things First was started to see if we could actually change attitudes and behaviors when it comes to marriage and divorce and out of wedlock births, and helping fathers to understand they actually really do have a very important role in the lives of their children, and that marriage matters. And so here we are 22 years in, and we're still very much about those goals. We teach relationship skills to many just across the board, starting in high school and beyond. I think one of the things that has been very eye-opening for us, we were teaching healthy relationship skills and fathering skills in the jail. And we kept seeing men cycle back through. They would get out and we would see them back in class, and we're asking, what are you doing back in here? They're in for child support, lack of child support payments. And so at that point, we said, we've got to do something different. And so we put together a pilot project in 2011 just to see if we could work with the courts for these men who were on the verge of being incarcerated, we're talking huge poverty issues because they were getting out, they can't find a job, they're in with, to Eric's point, the very same people that they don't need to be back in with, and so they land right back in jail. And not helpful to the children, not helpful to men, not helpful to our community. So we launched this pilot project in 2011. It has been wildly successful, more than we could have ever fathomed. One story I think about in particular, Mark, he's one of 10 children by 10 different men. His mother married a man that was not the father of any of them. They were actually living a middle-class lifestyle until the older brother got sideways with stepdad, and that blew up the whole family. Mark went to live with his father, who was living in the inner city, and with no supervision, Mark got involved in gangs and drugs and all kinds of stuff. Got 2 women pregnant with his children, and for a decade, over a decade, was in and out of jail for lack of child support and other issues. And then he showed up in court in Hamilton County, basically the magistrate seeing him as a lost cause. And we have a video that tells a bit of his story.
Yeah, let's run the First Things First video now.
I hate to be dramatic, but my life has been through a lot of changes, ups and downs. I've experienced both good and bad times. Didn't see any hope. I also was incarcerated for child support, non-payment for 3 of my other kids because I had problems finding employment. I was on my way to jail again. When I left home that day, I kissed everybody, and I knew I was going to jail. It's a hurting feeling to leave your kids. I really didn't know what First Things First was at the time. They gave me the information, and he told me what First Things First was offering me, the DMD, Dad's Making a Difference class. Over the course of me going to class, And upon me graduating, I went to court constantly throughout this process. As long as I was in compliance with going to class and participating, they were willing to not incarcerate me. My last court date, I went in and the judge dismissed everything. She said, you don't have to come back to court. When she said that to me, I was just overwhelmed, like so happy, because I never thought I would be reunited with having a family.
That's such an amazing story of the impact of dads making a difference.
Well, it's powerful because this man was actually actively engaged in the lives of 3 of his children. And he made the decision to marry the mom of these children, but he was going to go to jail for the other children that were adults at this point. So we were going to rip a family apart to deal with this other situation. And I think that that is something we need to address.
Yeah, and it's you've become a trusted agent in the community.
Yes.
That the decision makers know that this is changing the dynamics of a vicious cycle.
Yes, and we're very excited about that.
That's an amazing thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Sharpell, let's turn now and be focusing. Julie's led us nicely into focusing on the solutions to these challenges we've just named. Could you tell us more about the model of Friendship House? You've talked about planting a married couple in a community, and that is just the beginning. Can you expand from there and tell us about who you're serving?
Sure. So I talked a little bit about Allendale. One of the statistics that Allendale had that we were not proud of is that there were about 350 violent crimes committed within a 30-block radius of my home per year. It's almost one every day. Since community renewal, we came in the early 2000s, and we have what we call a friendship house. These couples that I talked about earlier, we move into the friendship houses. Part of our home is what we call a community room. It's a place where we host after-school programs for children, and these are high-risk kids. These are the kids who, if they were not at my home at 4 p.m., they would probably be planning to rob you. These are kids who were either dropped out of school or on the verge of dropping out of school 6 years ago. These are children who, we have teenagers who are in high school who could not look at an analog clock and tell time, could not tie their shoes, could not count change at a grocery store, could not just look you in the eye and answer a question with a complete sentence. Since moving into the neighborhood, my husband and I got busy. It took us about 1.5 years. We talked about trust a lot. We moved into our neighborhood, and it took us about 1.5 years to gain the trust of our neighbors. The kids were being told not to talk to us. They thought my husband was a narcotics agent or some type of spy. He's this big guy from Texas. And so we began to just walk with our neighbors. Talk like them, dress like them, eat with them, go to their homes, have a beer, whatever it takes to create relationships, to build relationships with our neighbors. And that took a long time before the kids would open up to us. Because some of the things we were coming into this neighborhood to try and change, you must understand that we wanted to tackle the drug problem among youth in our neighborhood and the gang violence. Well, that's hard to do when I'm talking to a little boy whose uncle is the head of the gang in the neighborhood. So it takes a lot of courage for them to change the trajectory of their lives. So we come in and we have an after-school program where we teach character building. Sometimes we have a curriculum. Sometimes we just assess the kids as they walk through the door. And we deal with real-life situations. Monday, we know that everybody's coming in really hungry because they've scavenged all weekend. There's no school on weekends, so some of them probably haven't eaten since lunch on Friday. And so we tackle issues as they are faced. Teach them things like the value of hard work being its own reward. Teach them the value of just being married before you commit to having children. When we had the marriage discussion in our club, we call it Youth Club, one of the girls literally told me, Miss Sharpell, black people don't get married. I was like, but Mr. Emmett and I are married. She said, really? You're real deal married? Like on paper? We said, like, on paper. I'll show you the paper. And so just changing those mindsets that there is a value in having a husband and planning a family and planning a career and not just letting life happen, but making life happen for you. And in the past 15 years, our statistics have changed. Crime is down in my neighborhood 60% since moving the Friendship House into that neighborhood. Right now, Allendale was a place that nobody wanted to come to. Right now, it's safer to live next door to me than one of the more affluent neighborhoods in our city. We have the second lowest crime rate in the city right now. We have homeowners for the first time in a long time in Allendale. Since before the crack epidemic, we've turned things around to where people aren't renting houses, are not living on government subsidy. They're owning their own homes. And just that alone comes with a sense of pride. It's mine, so I'm going to do what it takes to keep it. I'm going to find jobs. So our job skills program we have, while the children are at school, adults come to us who have not completed high school, and they study for their GED and take those tests, and then we teach them job readiness skills. A lot of soft skills happen before they ever enter the classroom, anger management and just basic conversational skills. And my husband teaches welding on Saturdays to some of the guys who need a skill, and maybe they are ex-offenders who cannot even apply for a job as soon as they see that. So there are ways of getting ahead without succumbing to the trap that I think some of these big programs set for our people. And it's working. It's working. I said crime was down. Some of these guys that we are teaching welding and some of the ladies are learning sewing and marketing skills. They are the first in their family in generations to have legal, gainful employment. And so the neighborhood is rising together. And it's wonderful to see. It's a beautiful thing to watch.
And that's happening because you moved in and made it a we. And
it's our problem. It's not your problem. It's not those people. Let's do better for our neighborhood.
It's wonderful. And continual innovation as you're seeing it face to face.
Absolutely. It takes a commitment, and it takes, the children and the adults, you can see the skepticism in their face when you first meet them. They are waiting on you to disappoint them. They've been disappointed so much in life. They've had so many negative things happen to them. They already expect you to view them as not worthy. And so it takes a while to build that trust. And as they see your commitment and that your love is real, there's a supernatural thing that happens. And so love begets love. And once you have that, now we can work together to rebuild the relational fabric of this community.
Amen. Well, Julie, I want to stay on this on-the-ground perspective. And you've been around several decades and continued to innovate as you see new needs. And can you tell us about some of the newer resources that you've developed that are matching what you're seeing out there?
Well, just to comment on your whole conversation about marriage and Black people don't get married, I think one of the things that we have experienced with both our premarital education experiences and with Dad's Making a Difference is the men specifically really almost indignant, like, nobody ever told me marriage mattered. Why has nobody told me this? And then actually recognizing I want that, not just for me, but for this woman that I've been with for a period of time and for my children. The other thing that we have seen is the collaborative opportunities working with the courts and child support enforcement and American Job Centers to help people find jobs. We've had people who have been convicted of murder and have served their time and come back into the community, not thinking that they could ever contribute or be productive, actually go through our premarital, our marriage enrichment, Dad's Making a Difference, only to come back to us and say, I own a home, I have a car, I have a job, I am a member of this community, and I'm proud of that. And so what we've done to innovate is to actually, we don't just stand in front of people and lecture. We're very experiential about what we do, and we bring people in, magistrates, judges, who will talk about, this is the law. This is where I have no wiggle room whatsoever. Here's where I have opportunity to work with you, and here's where I need your help. I need you to actively see you can do some things differently. And so I think through us being trusted and recognize that you're not a number to us, and we're here because we offer a variety of opportunities for you to engage with us. We're not a one and done experience. Many of the guys who go through Dad's Making a Difference and premarital education and marriage enrichment actually participate in a leadership team where they're bringing other guys in, saying these people, they really can give you information and skills that will help you help yourself. They're not going to give you a handout. They're going to teach you how to do this and do it well.
That's wonderful, and seeing the generations of change, being those who have been transformed able to come alongside them.
Yes, and saying to their kids, I want something better for you. I do not want you to repeat what I have done.
Well, I was also, when we caught up earlier this year, I was really struck by the range of audiences that you're reaching. Can you tell a little bit about your the initiative to reach truckers?
Yes, we have an initiative called mytruckerlife.com. And the reason that we started it is because we have a number of trucking companies, long-haul trucking companies in our area, and the turnover rate is like 300%. It's very high, and a lot of divorce and family dysfunction as a result of being on the road. But what we found in working with them is that nobody prepares them to help them be gone, to leave well, to function well while they're gone, and then to re-enter. They also don't prepare the family. So oftentimes they would say, we come back home, and it's like, you just be over here and let us do our thing, because if you get in here, you're going to mess up our rhythm. And so they feel like an outsider, but then they experience the conflict and the angst with their spouse because you're not helping, you're not dealing with the discipline issues that we're experiencing. So My Trucker Life is actually online learning for both the family at home and the trucker to help them have relationship skills, to help them understand how I can parent from a distance effectively, how I can actually be helpful to my spouse while I'm on the road, like they feel cared for while I'm gone for this extended period of time, and then how to come back and be a part of the family. So we've piloted it. We have over 800 subscribers at this point, both family and truckers, and we're getting ready to launch big time in February.
That's wonderful. Congratulations. It's a really wonderful project. Well, let me come back to the policy perspective, Robert. And you made the point in your previous comment that we've got to make sure that government is not harming marriage. And yet, tell us about the structure of what's happening and particularly what can be done to overcome that, some specifics that you've provided.
What we need to recognize is that after so many decades, we sort of realized that what the decline of marriage has done in low-income communities. But the issue now is as well that this is now creeping up into, more than creeping up into middle-income, middle-educated communities as well, with the same sort of effects. And one problem here is that the United States spends about $500 billion a year on means-tested programs to assist low-income families, so very cash, food, housing, medical care, and so forth. And a means-tested program, the way it works is, as the income in a family goes up, the benefits go down. But the income that's measured in the family is the aggregate income of the husband and the wife. And what that really means, in a simple sense, is that for most of these families, if they get married, the husband's income now goes on the accounting sheet, and the benefits are dramatically cut. And so, for example, if you take a mother that maybe earns $20,000 a year, and she marries the father of her children who also earns $20,000 a year, and they have 2 kids, they will immediately lose $6,000 to $7,000 in welfare benefits. That's a tax rate of 15% on their income. If they have 3 kids, they're going to lose about $9,000 a year. Because conservatives are obsessed with economics, they say, oh, marginal tax rates to reduce work and so forth. There really aren't substantial marginal tax rate issues with respect to work, but they're massive with respect to marriage. It's a huge, huge penalty which we impose on marriage, not through the tax system, but through the welfare system. So what could we do about that? This is largely regarded as an utterly insoluble problem, but in reality, it can be solved, and it can be solved without additional cost. The way to do that is to start with a program called the Earned Income Tax Credit, and take the Earned Income Tax Credit, which we spend about $80 billion a year, and turn it into what it should be, which is an hourly wage supplement. It's supposed to be linked to earnings, but it's not actually linked to either wage rates or the amount of work being performed, which makes it very poorly targeted. So you could take this existing money and, for example, turn it into an hourly wage supplement such that a mother with 2 children who earn $10 an hour, you could give them, say, a $6 an hour wage supplement on top of the $10 an hour. And you could provide that, say, up to the first 1,800 hours of work in the family. But then the trick is, if the number of hours of work goes above 1,800 hours, you don't take it away. And immediately then you've now eliminated the marriage penalty, because you allow the father to come in the home. He's working more than the 1,800 hours when you put them together, but we're not taking the benefits away now. And instantly when you do that, the marriage penalty evaporates. And you can effectively remove the marriage penalty from the EITC. You can offset it in the food stamp program. You can offset it in housing. You can basically do it across the board without an increase in expenditure. Now, what could I predict? Well, there's some studies, as there always are, that would show this has a very significant effect in increasing marriage. And there are other studies that show something different. That's the nature of studies. But the reality is, as Brad Wilcox has said, the first and foremost thing you need to do here is do no harm. And it's very obvious, it's self-evident, that you don't want to have a welfare system that's communicating the message, get married and we'll hit you financially. Right. And this system is, the way it is not an accident. It is because the welfare system was created in a way that was indifferent to marriage, many of the people involved in it were actively hostile to having fathers in the home. At the very least, they're indifferent to it, and that's why we've developed this system where it's essentially a system of father replacement. It is designed to support single parenthood. The father is an impediment or an encumbrance, and we will whack you if you get married. And we've actually created a situation now where it is economically irrational for virtually all low-income mothers and fathers to get married and to be honest about it. They can hide it, okay? But if they get married and they're honest about it, we actively and aggressively penalize them for doing that. That is self-evidently insane, and we should simply stop doing it.
Right. So this proposal for the Earned Income Tax Credit is really the first concrete policy proposal to tackle a marriage penalty in the welfare state, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And we've talked about that for a while, but this is really putting that into practice. Well, Chris, let me come back to you. And in America Lost, in your documentary, one of the observations you make is that we faced economic challenges before as a country, but the coinciding of economic collapse with the breakdown of institutions that have been the backbone of struggling communities, that's what's the new combination that's really, as Nick put it, wounding our nation. So could you talk, that's going on, and yet you also found rays of hope in the midst of this. So just take us through that kind of arc of your story.
Yeah, I think what you see is something, we've had economic problems in the United States every 10 to 20 years. You had a Great Depression, and if you look at even the photographs of the Great Depression, you see people who are economically destitute, but you see the way that even the kind of Hoovervilles or shanty towns are organized. You get the sense there's actually a functioning social organization, even in these very desperate economic circumstances. You see pictures of men shaving, you see people getting dressed, you see families together, and we don't have that now.
on the surface, we have very low unemployment. We have kind of record high median wages. But we have these desperate social and cultural problems. And I don't think that you can say that they're solely a result of economic factors. Another observation, trying to make comparisons, both over time and then also in different cultures and places. I'm Italian, I'm also American, so half my family's in Italy, half my family's here. And over the summer, we sometimes spend time in a very small village in the Italian Apennine Mountains, where my family is from for 500 years. And this is a place that is extremely poor. They lost a Fiat factory. You have very high unemployment. You have youth unemployment above 50%. You have even the median wage in Italy is roughly equivalent to the poverty wage in the United States. Italy is not a wealthy country. And even in a very distressed, economically poor village, you see a functioning society. You see people getting up. You see people helping each other. You see functioning families. You see the mechanisms of social enforcement and cultural norms that are creating a really healthy society despite an economic condition that is not good on the surface. So I think if you take that 360-degree view, you see something that has gone very wrong in a cultural sense. And it's in many quarters, I'm in Seattle, Washington, certainly in my quarter, but it's very difficult to even talk about. If you say the word culture, people get real creeped out, and they kind of get defensive about it. But I think it's undeniable that these are massive social problems that we're going to require a social, cultural, kind of normative solution. And I think the distinction between what Robert's talking about and what you're talking about, I saw that over and over. You look at a city like Youngstown, Ohio. What happens when people talk about, oh, the steel mills disappeared and then everything is bad, right? Anyone heard that story? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The story that no one is telling, that I try to show in the film, is that the steel mills disappear and then the bureaucracy replaces them. So in Youngstown, Ohio, if you look at the census data, you have about 10% of the population that works in the public bureaucracy, institutions that are direct government or largely funded by government. And you have 50% of people that are surviving on means-tested programs. And you have about 20% that are in the productive private economy. And looking at this another way, if you look at all the private sector wages in Youngstown, and then you look at all of the federal transfer payments to Mahoning County, federal transfer payments are 2 times greater than all private sector wages combined. So 2/3 of the economy is driven by federal policy, despite the fact that I don't think many people in DC have a real sense of what people need on the grounds and the kind of nooks and crannies in Youngstown, because it's very complicated. And then what you have is you have a big permanent bureaucracy, and you have people that are running what I think of as the gauntlet. I have social worker on Monday. I have my probation officer on Tuesday. I have to go to my anger management class Thursday through Friday. I have to show up for this. I can't get a job. I'm doing too many appointments.
Right.
And it's like, and then you see the movie The Joker. Did anyone see The Joker? Where the Joker goes to his kind of social worker psychiatrist, and she doesn't care. And you have a very different sense of someone who says, I'm here because I want to be here, not because I'm getting paid to be here. And that's a really fundamental difference. I think that you can separate out kind of artificial community, right? Bureaucratically driven community, which has, frankly, a poor record of success, with someone who comes in and says, I'm not driving in from the suburbs and getting paid, and when it's 5 o'clock, I'm out of here. I live here. If you need to call me at 2 in the morning, I'll show up to your house. And building that authentic relationship is fundamental. And you can't do it from the outside in. It has to be from the inside out. And that's the biggest takeaway that I saw over and over and over.
That's really helpful. Now that we've advertised your film a couple of times, can you tell people where to find out more? Just because I think we'll have some curiosity.
Yeah, you can. It's americalostfilm.com is the website, and this film will actually broadcast nationally on PBS next year. So looking maybe February, and it's actually very exciting because I've been making films for PBS and Netflix and other broadcasters for about 10 years.
And then I kind of came out of the closet a few years ago as a conservative-leaning person, which I'll tell you was rough. I actually I lost a lot of working relationships. I had people that in the kind of film world, which, as you imagine, is very kind of ideologically and progressively driven, wouldn't return my calls. I had a longtime editor say, "I can't work on your films anymore." I mean, it is really a kind of it was a lesson in just how kind of how ideologically driven our cultural institutions are, and how if you kind of play outside of those lines, it's very difficult. But luckily, I think what I tried to do in the film is present the case that I think is philosophically conservative, but in language that connects beyond just kind of the base of people who might share those philosophical convictions. And I still haven't figured out if they like the film and they want some viewpoint diversity, or if it kind of didn't register yet. So we'll see when the film broadcasts next year. But I hope that it's something that can convey across just the people that are in this room, right? I imagine most of us are on the same side, but we really need to figure out what I think of as a new moral vocabulary to communicate these ideas to the mainstream, because frankly, some of the language that you use, is dated and has a lot of baggage. If you think about even the phrase family values, that's tough. That's going to turn off a lot of people. I don't think it should, but it does. And we need to kind of evolve a moral language that communicates these universal truths, right? And I think it's inherent, and the people that I met in these cities, it's inherent and embedded in the human psyche. I had a woman, Katrina, in Memphis. We were filming one day, and she says, we're going to go to the jail. All right, let's go to the jail. She takes her two daughters to the jail. And she brings a little picture, and she says, this is my father. He was in jail my entire 0 through 18. I never met him till I was 18 years old. And your father, daughter on the right, he was in this jail. Your father, daughter on the left, he was also in this jail. And then she says, I dropped out of school in 8th grade, but I want something better for you. And then she says, you got to stay in school. College is a must, and get married before having kids. Mm-hmm. I just want better for y'all. Mm-hmm. I said, well, that's the success sequence, right? I mean, she didn't need a sociologist. Right. She didn't read an academic journal. Right. These are things that are natural human experiences. And then even though she lives in a neighborhood of 6,000 people with only 10 nuclear families, that's a disaster, right? But there's something embedded in the human spirit itself. You look at thousands of years of history in the anthropological literature. Family is the natural human condition. We've done something very wrong in the last 75 years or so. But I think that if we can remove whatever we did wrong and let that human spirit come through, I think we can see a regeneration and a restoration of these fundamental institutions. Yeah.
That is a wonderful statement. And one of our earlier panelists was sharing beforehand and emphasizing the moral courage. And I think your comment about a new moral vocabulary that connects with those universal human aspirations for wholeness and harmony in our relationships and in our inner lives as well. Well, you ended on a very nice ray of hope. And I just want to invite a couple of you, if you have any closing thoughts about these are very dire situations we're dealing with. And yet you are clearly animated with hope. And share with us some of the things that are giving you hope at this time, just briefly.
Sure. Right off the top of my head, I was thinking when Julie was talking about one of the youth that we served, his name was Corian. Corian didn't come to our after-school program like the other kids, just living in the neighborhood. Corian came to our after-school program because he was facing 2 to 10 years in prison at 16 years of age. He had dropped out of school. And talk about connectivity and relationships that matter. Corian's defense attorney knew of community renewal. He made a call to my husband, said, can you meet me at the courthouse in an hour? Got dressed, went down there, and was able to stand before the judge and just talk about this work and what we are doing in the community that Corian lives, and that we are a resource, right? So the judge, like you said, he has these things he has to follow, and then he has some wiggle room over here. He released Corian to my husband, told him show up for youth club every day, don't miss a day, get in school, make at least a C average, or you will go, I will hide you in prison, literally. Admonished his mom to get involved in what we were doing. Long story short, this past May, Corian graduated high school, a straight A student. Corian is now gainfully employed while he is studying to be a welder. He wants to own his own business one day. And we have story after story like Corian. A story of a little girl, Chantel, who one of the things I work with the girls on is personal hygiene and first impressions and things like that. Black hair is hard to maintain. And so we had this hair braiding class and we learned to braid hair. Chantel was so good at it. She went home, taught her mom and her sister how to braid hair. Mom, when we moved into the neighborhood, Mom was a dope dealer. She sold drugs and she was a prostitute. That's how she paid her bills. Mom learned to braid hair, began to braid hair for the girls and the women in the neighborhood. Called my husband crying. Now, this is a mom who never got involved. She didn't show up at any family nights, any school events. We went to the parent and teacher conferences for Chantel because she was on the verge of dropping out of school as well. But just out of the blue, after midnight, one night, called my husband up with tears in her eyes, saying that watching the transformation of her daughter has caused her to want to do better in life. She said, Mr. Welch, every bill I have is due, and I don't want to do what I know how to do to make money. We suggested, just start braiding hair. We'll pay you. I went and got my hair braided, or she came over and braided my hair. I called everybody I knew. Hey, you want to try a new hairstyle? She made enough money to pay all her bills that month and has been successfully entrepreneurial since then, legally entrepreneurial. And so that's the domino effect of these sort of grassroots, in the trenches sort of changes that we're trying to make. It doesn't just touch the child that you touch, but it touches everybody that child comes into contact with. And it's as far-reaching as the connections we could make across this country.
That is wonderful. Sharpelle, I think you've given us the high note to end on. So let's join me in thanking our panel.
Awesome.
Please join me in welcoming Congressman Mike Johnson.
I'm really honored to be with all of you. I'm fans of your interest here, your work, and we want to support you in every way we can. Thank you, Jennifer and Heritage, for hosting this and being on the front lines of this important work for so long. You guys are such an inspiration to us. I'm really proud also to see my hometown of Shreveport, Louisiana represented, and great job, Sharpelle and Emmett. Thanks for all you do. He doubles as a bodyguard in the neighborhood. You might have noticed he's looks like an offensive lineman in the NFL, so that doesn't hurt either. They're going to keep him straight in Allendale. I know that. I'm really grateful about that work because I believe, and I know many of you understand this. I'm preaching to the honor choir today, of course, but the issues of poverty is something that we have to empower communities and the institutions within our communities to really tackle and address. And as policymakers, I'm really committed, our group really believes that we basically need to get out of the way. We need to set up the right policy framework that empowers communities to take the lead. If we operate under the assumption that we have all the silver bullet answers and solutions in Washington, then that's going to lead to failure, obviously. I believe, as Reagan famously said, of course, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And we need to get government out of the way so that the human spirit can flourish. And, I was struck by your example about the hair braiding idea, the entrepreneurial spirit, and how that can lift somebody out of poverty, something that simple. But a perfect illustration of government being in the way. In our home state of Louisiana, we're so over-regulated. We license everything. And in my state, you have to have a license to braid hair. Can you believe? I mean, it's crazy. So it's a perfect example of how we just need to look at these things with fresh eyes. So I chair the Republican Study Committee. You may know RSC is the largest caucus in Congress, largest caucus of conservatives, to be sure. We have 146 members in the House. Everybody who Basically, everybody who self-identifies as a conservative is in this group. It's like herding cats, as you might imagine, but we are really doing a lot of good substantive work. The group's been around since the mid-'70s, 1975. It was created. Ed Follner of Heritage was the first executive director, and he famously said at that time the purpose of this group was to be the intellectual arsenal of conservatism in the House of Representatives, and we take that charge very seriously. Our purpose is to try to steer the legislative process and public policy to the right, and to defend what we regard to be the core conservative principles of individual freedom and limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, free markets, fiscal responsibility, and human dignity. And the human dignity aspect is, of course, what we're all talking about today. We believe there's not just core conservative ideas, they're core American ideas. They're quintessential American principles, right? The founders famously said they acknowledged, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Another self-evident truth, Robert, of course, that we're all created by God. We're created equally. We're given our rights from God, not from the government. And what follows from that is this idea about human dignity, that if that's true, then it means every single person has inestimable dignity and value. And your value is not related in any way to the color of your skin or what your zip code you live in, where you went to school, or how attractive you are, whatever. Your value is inherent because it is given to you by your Creator. And so that animates our approach to public policy and to these really important issues that we're all facing. These are the universal truths, as was just said on the stage, and you're exactly right about that. So at the beginning of this year, we really felt this area, these issues are so important. RSC works, the way we organize all these 146 members is we separate into working groups and task forces to come up with public policy to put onto paper these overarching principles, to put it into legislative text. And so one of the task forces we created is called the American Worker Task Force. And as the name implies, it's focused primarily on policies that encourage, support, and unleash workers. It would obviously be impossible to focus on those issues without also thinking more broadly about the role of work, the dignity of work, how that impacts families and communities and, of course, individuals. The task force is going to release a public report early next year. We're targeting probably March timeframe, and it's going to be full of reforms, our ideas on areas as broad as higher ed and labor markets and tax and regulatory issues and welfare reform. Look, I think, we believe that our public policy in this country ought to always emphasize not only education, but the virtue of hard work, because that's a pathway out of poverty. And we believe public assistance ought to be reserved for those that are truly in need. And when we squander those resources, we hurt the people that those programs are intended to help the most, of course. And we believe that in America, I mean, the American dream, as we would define it, is that if you are willing to work hard and play by the rules and sacrifice a little bit, you ought to get a fair shot. And everything we do is kind of driven in that, because again, these are just the quintessential American ideals. So I came here from a meeting of the American Worker Task Force. It just so happened it was scheduled this morning. They meet regularly, and we talked about a number of recommendations in the welfare space. We're certainly inspired by the work of Robert, who you just heard from, and for so many years his name was evoked many times in the meeting this morning. We're talking about things like TANF reform and work requirements and disability reform and housing policy and unemployment insurance, among others. And one of the signature policy items that we approved for inclusion in our final report by the group just a couple hours ago was a series of reforms to the earned income tax credit, again, thanks to Robert. And this hourly wage supplement idea is something that we really think can have some legs. And this is something we've been working closely with Heritage on for several months, and we actually going to introduce some legislation on this next year. Representative Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri is an RSC member. He's on Ways and Means Committee, so y'all be looking for that. One of the most important pieces of reform will be the systematic removal of the giant marriage penalty, which we just discussed here, that currently overshadows the program. And perhaps the most important thing that could be done to combat poverty, and in particular childhood poverty, of course, is to have communities with strong marriages. So I'm certainly not suggesting the federal government has all these answers or has the power or the ability to mandate strong marriages, but as I mentioned earlier, we believe our job is just to create the right policy framework to unleash communities to take the lead on this, to empower people like these heroes that are sitting on the stage this morning so that they can do what they do so well. Fixing policies that discourage marriage ought to be at the top of that list. And I can assure you it's one of the top priorities of all the members of the Republican Study Committee. We have a lot more to say about this next year, so I hope that that you'll stay tuned in. And I want to say this to you as an invitation. We would love to have all of you help us make this successful next year. So if you have an interest in what we're doing with the task force, if you have ideas and your insights, we would be so grateful to take that in and hear from you. You can talk with our staff about it. Alexa's in the back over here. Dan Ziegler's our executive director. You can contact my office. Ruth is here somewhere, my scheduler and office. So where's Ruth? Where's Ruth? Ruth's in the very back. Okay. Talk with one of us or give us a call and let us know. Look, I'm going to close with this and tell you I have personal insights on this experience on all these issues, everything we talked about. The reason I'm so passionate about this is because we've lived it in a way, just a very, in a 1-minute summary of a story that could take 45 minutes. Right after my wife Kelly and I were married in 1999, we obtained one of the first Louisiana covenant marriages. It was authored by Tony Perkins at FRC when he was a state legislator. And they because no one else wanted the job, I think they appointed us the spokescouple for covenant marriage. So we're like this young couple, getting flown all around the country. We did ABC, Good Morning America, CBS News and all that. Diane Sawyer's interviewing my beautiful wife, and I didn't get a word in edgewise. I'm the lawyer. I didn't get to say anything. But right after that, we had a very interesting experience. A couple of years prior, when I was a sophomore in law school, I started working with the Young Life Ministry in Baton Rouge, and I befriended a young man named Michael, and he had a story not unlike one of the ones that was told here this morning. Came from really a bad home situation. His mother had a lot of problems. There was 4 siblings, all by different daddies. He never knew his father. Long story short, he was put on the street. So we took him in as a newlywed couple. We took custody of Michael and took him into our family. He's a 14-year-old African-American boy who effectively became our son, is our son. Right now, it's a success story because he is living in California with his own 3 children, and he and Adonde it's an American dream story. But he tells people now he's 6'7". He looks like my bodyguard. At the time, he was shorter than me. But he tells the story now that there's no doubt that he would either be in prison or killed, as he says, if God had not ordained that situation where we were just there to pull him out of that. And so I get so frustrated. I'm just being honest. I get so frustrated when fellow conservatives say, oh, well, these people just need to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. Well, these kids like that, they don't even know what a bootstrap is, right? And you have to, it takes that personal, it's not something government can do. It has to be individuals, it has to be families, it has to be people who do have stable marriages to step into that scenario like you guys are doing so heroically. And I'm just really, I got Jesus bumps on the back of my neck right now talking about it. I'm just really grateful for the investment of time, energy, effort, and heart that all you guys put into this. So it's so important. Again, I'm just so thankful to have the chance to speak with you today. The work being done by the people in this room is going to have lasting impacts into eternity, and we commend it. So I hope you will consider us, the Republican Study Committee, your partners in this endeavor, and that we can use that relationship to do a whole lot of good now and in the future. So thanks so much. Thanks again for letting me speak for a moment. Appreciate it.
Congressman Johnson, Mike, it is an honor to call you a friend, and thank you for taking the time to come over. It's an encouragement to all of us just to see you where you are, your commitment, and the work that you're doing to advance conservative values, and particularly on these issues. Thank you so much. So it's a joy for me to look out and see so many dear friends here. I'm Charmaine Yost. I'm the Vice President of the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity for those of you who are going to be new friends after today. Would you take a minute before I turn to introducing the speaker who's going to wrap everything up for us today? No pressure, Senator. Would you take a minute with me to thank Jennifer and Marie for the work that they did in putting together this outstanding day? So I would also, on behalf of Heritage President Kay Coles-James, thank you all and welcome you to the Heritage Foundation. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and be with us to talk about this very important issue. We've had speakers and 2 great panels today that we specifically designed in order to hear from a mix of policy experts and practitioners on how we can overcome poverty. Thank you so much to this last panel, to the 2 of you in particular, for wrapping us up with an optimistic and a forward-looking. That was very encouraging to me. We want to continue to provoke a deepening dialogue between these 2 groups so that your work in each of these areas, both in data and also work with actual real people, can best fuel each other and ultimately serve the people and the communities that we hope to better. We've talked about the importance of work, providing purpose and a sense of dignity, and we've talked about the urgency of restoring marriage and community. And as the Vice President of the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity, you should know that internally I keep telling them that's a way too long of a title. But the longer that I've been here, I just started at Heritage in March, the more I've come to appreciate the significance of putting those 3 words together, family, community, and opportunity, as the signifier of the work that our team is doing together. Because at the heart of so many of the societal challenges we confront, from health to welfare to education to job training to violence in our communities to the growing markers of despair, all of these issues come back to the decay we see in the family structure and the weakening of our communities that ultimately undermines opportunity. Did you know that the latest data shows that we have 19.7 million American children living in single-parent homes? I don't think we've mentioned that huge number yet today. That is enough children to very nearly populate the entire city of Beijing, China, which is one of the largest cities in the entire world. 19.7 million children. Among those children who are living specifically in father-absent homes, over half have no support agreement from their father. And perhaps even worse than this issue of the financial support, nearly 40% of them had no contact with their dad last year, no contact with their father. So as people who are engaged in this issue from a policy perspective, I want to challenge you today to take away from this conversation a reminder that we have to maintain a focus on marriage as a starting point. We won the argument many, many years ago that the 2-parent family is the best place for children and also for the 2 parents who are trying to raise them. And yet, as recently as July, The Atlantic published an article, The Case Against Marriage, What You Lose When You Gain a Spouse. So we're still in the thick of it. We're still in the thick of it, despite the fact that the data is incontrovertible. And that's why it really is my great honor to introduce to you today someone who is courageous and committed, and at the same time also very shrewd and strategic, just the kind of person you want in this pitched battle. It's just the kind of person that we desperately need in the United States Senate. I know you all know him. You've seen him on your television, on the Senate floor, out across America, forcefully and persuasively articulating a conservative message. He began his public service in the Charleston County Council, then moved to serving in the South Carolina House of Representatives, the United States House, and finally the United States Senate. He's been a great defender of school choice, which we particularly appreciate. But honestly, out of all his accomplishments, there is one in particular I'd like to highlight. As the mother of a high school freshman, I hope he'll address, not to change your speech at all, but I hope he'll address how he pulled off one of his greatest accomplishments in my mind. He only got to where he is today after failing 4 of his classes his freshman year in high school. My son's a freshman in high school. Did I mention that? So that's a person who knows what it means to turn things around and promote change. I'm really looking forward to what he has to say to us today, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming to the Heritage Foundation, Senator Tim Scott.
I hope you're enjoying your new position.
I absolutely
Awesome. That's exciting. Well, thank you all for your commitment to trying to find a way to eradicate poverty. I know that this day has been focused on that specific subject, and I appreciate the Heritage Foundation, your commitment to making sure that we never lose sight on what's most important in our society. And what's most important in our society is making sure that we all have this sense of cohesion, the sense of family that comes from all of us working in the same direction for the same objectives. And I will answer your question. Some of the folks in the room have unfortunately heard that answer too many times because I've spoken a couple of times, and I oftentimes refer back to my time when I was in high school. I think once I was here, I asked a question in the audience, how many guys failed out of high school? And I was the only person with my hand, so I put it down. So failing is certainly English and Spanish. My joke is if you fail English and Spanish, no one calls you bilingual. Nobody. They do call you ignorant because you can't speak in any language. Number one. Number two, I also failed world geography and civics. Now we know God has a sense of humor because when you fail civics and you're in the United States Senate, something hilarious has happened. Now, having failed civics as a freshman, I will tell you that after 7 years in the United States Senate, I am not the only one failing civics in Congress. I'll just leave it there. I will tell you that the joke goes that the way I made it out my freshman year is because I had a mother who believed in prayer. And she prayed me through the hardest times in my life. And she was not only a prayer warrior, she was also an encourager. And she would stoke the embers of what was possible constantly. And when the embers seemed to be dead, she'd walk me outside and she gave me a new form of encouragement, which was a switch. Now, for those of you who grew up with Time Out, a switch is a southern apparatus of encouragement. It is typically applied from your belt to your ankles, and I was thoroughly encouraged to go to summer school and catch up with my class and focus on studying and not being the class clown. So in the end, that was how I escaped the tragedy of my poor performance. It wasn't my teachers, however. It was me. It wasn't my school. It was me. And really the question that she asked as she introduced me really is the question I wanted to address anyway. So I'm so thankful that the good Lord in his infinite wisdom had the right person at the right time doing the right thing and asking the right questions. And that's what happens in life. And that's how I see it. I want to ask a question that I think we all should look for the answer. How do we, and it's a simple question, how do we truly eradicate poverty in the places where it has been generationally persistent? I think the answer is not the answer that I've been working on for the last 20 years of public service. And it certainly has been helpful. The things that we're talking about in this room, helpful. But as I think through what delivered me from poverty, and when I talk to and interview hundreds of now successful people who grew up in the same circumstances that I did or worse, the thing that comes to mind is a story from the Bible. You find it in Numbers 13:33. It's the culmination of the story. And what this story is about is that the Israelites were getting ready to go into the promised land. And they didn't believe that they were going to make it into the promised land. So the good Lord told them to send 12 spies to the promised land. And the 12 spies came back with two different reports. 10 said, what had happened was, we ain't making it in the promised land because there are giants in the land. And 2 spies came back and said, wait a minute. Those 10 spies, I understand why they feel the way they do. And yes, there are giants in the land without any question. Those boys are bad to the bone. They're tall, they're big, they're strong, but at the same time, there are giants in the land. There are actually amazing fruit, amazing prosperity, and opportunities that are too amazing for my eyes to behold. Now, this is not exactly how it goes in Numbers, by the way. It's like this kind of. And the 2 spies were like, come on, man, let's go to the promised land. And the 10 spies convinced the people that there was no reason to take the journey into the promised land. And so as we know, for 40 years, they found themselves stuck outside of the promised land, which according to some experts is either an 11-day journey or a 6-week journey. No one thinks of it as a 40-year journey. But Numbers 13:33 gives us a little preview of why they didn't make it in, and it tells us why it's so hard to eradicate poverty. And what it simply says is this, that the people in the land sees us as grasshoppers. And therefore, we too see ourselves as grasshoppers. And the thing that really took me from being a kid, failing out of school, being a son in a single-parent household, being a person mired in poverty, to becoming more, was this notion that it was possible. The one thing my mother never lost was this sense of hope and wonder that this world, this nation, could afford her child an opportunity that would rock my world. And she was right. And if we don't find a way to embed within all the things that we do, this notion of wonder about who we are, why America is exceptional, if we don't restore as a part the basic fabric of our organizations, of our legislation, of our efforts, that all things are truly possible for all people, no matter where they are, no matter where they're from, and no matter the hurdles, we won't get there as an American family. I have been blessed to chair, more than a decade ago, the South Carolinians for Healthy Family Formation. I spent a lot of time in a few years trying to work on getting 2 parents in a household, because I know what the difference is having had 1 parent in a household, and until I was 7, 2 parents in a household. I know what it means from a language perspective. I know what it means from an income perspective. I know what it means from a work perspective. I know that it also allows for this complementary skill set in a mama and a daddy to work together to give the children the best perspective of who they can be. So I've worked on that. I also understand the importance of school choice, specifically charter schools, private schools, parochial schools. The one thing I see, whether it's Success Academy that has a student population that's 87% African American and Hispanic, but consistently one of the 41 or so schools that she has performs in the top of the 4,000 schools statewide. But if you walk into the school, you're not surprised that these kids are outperforming their peers. Because everywhere you turn, what you see on the walls, MIT, Harvard, Yale. I even brought Charleston Southern University, so they'd have a piece of the South with them over there. And the kids are talking about what they're going to be when they grow up. And they're writing papers about their futures. You see, they're having this sense of expectancy reinforced all the time. And so it's not simply that the Success Academy has more autonomy. This is true. And that autonomy allows them to do something that other schools don't do. It's not that it costs more money because they get half the funding. It's that their focus is on who the child will be and not simply what the child must learn. And if we remember the importance of who the child will be and help that child learn in the natural direction that they are predisposed to, you find yourself having success that is unrivaled. I've worked on apprenticeship programs because I know that if you are not successful while you're there, we need you to be successful when you leave, voluntarily or involuntarily. And I understand that apprenticeship programs are a key to getting some folks a skill set that they are missing. Because if you're 18 years old and you're not yet properly educated, the chances of you needing workforce development in apprenticeship programs is sky high. And these programs work because the folks who are in the programs are looking at what is possible when they're finished. You see, there's a scripture, Proverbs 29:18, that without a vision, people cast off restraint or they perish. That's just not a scripture in the Bible. That's just the natural law that governs our society, that governs each and every one of us. And if we're going to have successful school choice programs, it's because those programs understand equipping the child not just academically, but keeping the embers of hope and dreams alive. I've worked on legislation. My team is working on legislation that helps us reform our safety net program so as to not have a cliff on our program, so that we can encourage work. We encourage prosperity, but we encourage the development of a work ethic that allows you to get a raise and keep that raise without having all of your benefits fall off a cliff. I call that common sense, because if you don't do it, nothing else seems to work. But within that redesign of our programs, the one thing I keep reminding my team is that our goal isn't simply to keep them moving. We want them to know where they're moving to. Because if you have that vision of what's possible, if I'm talking about that vision of what's possible in the redesign of these benefits, I'm not talking about whether or not it's economically feasible for the country to continue to do the things that we ought not do because you can do it for yourself. It's not about the country's economic health that I want to redesign the programs. I believe that by default, if I can get people to do for themselves what they can do, our economy will be stronger. The health of our country financially will continue to improve, but more importantly, the American family grows stronger. And when we do that, all things become possible. And I have legislation, as we probably all know, on opportunity zones where I want to bring more resources back to specific areas. And by doing so, my hope is that we'll have that same conversation of what's possible in that arena. Because if we don't do something, it won't get done. And it can't get done through the government. It has to be private sector folks doing what private sector does, which is creating jobs. The government doesn't create jobs. So maybe my program works and it's a brilliant program. Maybe it fails and it's a miserable program. But the one thing I know is that the government doesn't have the solutions there. But if I can get people, entrepreneurs, who are investing their time and their resources in areas that they would not have gone to, we'll all, I believe, be in better shape. But whether it's through opportunity zones or through some other system or program, what we have to do is to make sure that embedded in every single community in this country are entrepreneurs. Because if you don't have entrepreneurs, the community doesn't change. The big corporation doesn't come in and start helping to improve the quality of lives of everyone in that community first. It's natural for the guy who starts a business like I did, that changed my economic fortune like it did. I hired folks from my neighborhood. And the folks that I hired from my neighborhood, I was willing to take the extra time to teach them. The folks who were incarcerated that I hired on my team, who went on to start their own business, start their own churches, are now doing really well. The African-American folks who took over when I left, two of my office managers were African-American females. One's a millionaire with her own Allstate insurance agencies in Florida. The other one, we're still praying for her. But literally, it doesn't always work out the way the storybook ends. But literally, what we did was we just replicated, duplicated. We just did what's natural. You teach people from where you are from how to do what you are doing, if they're naturally inclined to do it, and you get success that is kind of simple. It's not that hard. But if we don't start with this notion that we can, that we will, it just won't happen. So my ask of everyone here is not to stop doing what you're doing. I'm going to pray that you have more strength and more tenacity to continue down the road. I'm going to pray that you have the ability to ignore the hurdles and the side shots and the blind shots and the challenges that come with doing what you're doing for folks who not always will appreciate it. I'm going to ask that you embed within the code of your culture the importance of stoking the embers of dreams and possibility, making that just as important as what it is that you are called to do. Because if we don't do that part, we'll be here a decade from now having the same conversation about the same people who are stuck in the same places. That's not America. It's not even American. We can do the most amazing things because we are indeed an exceptional people. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Senator Scott. We've been building this network for several years, and Senator Scott has always had a good word for the right moment for us. So we appreciate that and hearing about your good work. Thank you. Well, we are going to move now to the finale of our program with the presentation of the World Magazine Hope Award for Effective Compassion. We've had the opportunity over several years to partner with World Magazine to profile and showcase their award for effective compassion given to an organization that really embodies the ideals that we've been talking about all day. So in order to give that award, I want to introduce Harvest Prude from World Magazine, and she'll be coming to the stage here to introduce our award winner and present the award. So Harvest, over to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning on behalf of World Magazine, and it's an honor to introduce the 2019 winner of World's Hope Award for Effective Compassion. World has covered poverty fighting for decades, but each year for the past 14 years, we've sent reporters to cities all over the country to profile Christian organizations doing effective work and helping people who are in need. We feature these groups in our magazine, on our website, and on our podcast. Each year, we invite readers and our listeners to vote for a winner among the regional finalists we select, with the winner receiving $10,000 provided by a world donor. This year, our readers chose Watered Gardens, a ministry that serves the poor and homeless in Joplin, Missouri. The ministry's founders are James and Marcia Whitford. They started a day center for the homeless around 20 years ago, but after a while, they realized that the same people kept coming through their doors. So they decided to try a new approach, one that would challenge people to escape poverty, not enable them to stay there. I'll let James explain how their ministry works, but I think this quote from shelter director Jocelyn Brisson really captures how Watered Gardens empowers people to transform their lives, including her own. She told us, "It's been my mission in life to let people know that me, the adult homeless person, works at a homeless shelter. Me, the addict strung out for 38 years, is now a substance abuse counselor. Me, the felon, has a master's in criminal justice. God has used all of that stuff. Being a shelter manager here, I can now give people hope." Mr. and Mrs. Whitford are here this morning. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating James and Marcia Whitfield from Watered Gardens, the winner of the 2019 Hope Award for Effective Compassion.
Thank you, Harvest. Thank you so much. All right. Okay, it's a picture. Okay, yep, thank you. So I know lunch is coming soon, and I've been given just a few minutes to share a little bit about our work. And I think maybe the best way that I could do that is just to share a couple of stories with you. And first of all, I do want to thank Harvest and World News Group for the great work that they do in highlighting models of effective compassion nationally. And Jennifer, thank you for the work you do in Heritage. As a guy who helps addicts, I myself am a little bit of an addict to the Daily Signal every day. And so, and certainly there are folks back at home in Southwest Missouri right now, a great team of people, hundreds of very committed volunteers who have done all of the work for this award, really. So I want to just share two quick stories with you that actually will jump right out of the slides of Eric Eberstadt earlier. So right from the very beginning, as he began to speak, I thought, oh my gosh, the two stories I want to share right out of that. And the first one is a story of a guy I met in the foyer of our outreach center. Now, our outreach center is that part of our ministry. We are engaging people who are struggling on a lot of fronts in some very serious ways. Mental health issues and severe addiction issues. And so that is the spot where we're engaging them. And it is also the place where we're providing just basic relief of food and shelter and clothing. It's also the place where we are inspiring people to dream again. So we don't just want to meet a need. We sit down and we get to know people. We inspire people to dream and actually tailor that dream into a vision statement and a plan with measurable objective goals that they begin to step through. So it was in that foyer that I met a man. I had not seen him before. He was tall. He had tattoos on his arms. He didn't have any teeth, which is kind of common for people who've had a methamphetamine addiction. And I just went up to this guy and I said, "Hey, what's your name?" And that question was the beginning of a relationship with a homeless guy named Jerry. Now, Jerry has a really bad past, and I'm not going to get into that, but his youth was very troubled with a lot of, he was in a drug-infested household and very abused. But I got to know Jerry on our second visit together. We're developing a relationship. We're sitting at a barbecue restaurant, and we're having a sandwich. We're sharing a sandwich, and he says the strangest thing. He says, "I've got to get back on my medication." Now, he'd come out of prison not too long ago. And he didn't seem like the kind of guy who needed to be on medication. I said, "Now, why do you need to be on medication?" The answer that followed was, "Because I need to get my housing." So it's important to understand that people connect a diagnosis to medication to subsidized housing. And then he went on to say that I need to get back on my disability too. Now I'm looking at Jerry and I'm thinking, you don't look disabled, you don't look sick, and I told him that. And in fact, I knew he really wasn't because he'd already been working in our Worth shop to earn his bed and his meals and his clothing. Our Worth shop is that place where people earn things they need. We believe that work awakens worth in people's lives. And so if you want the outcome of employment from your nonprofit, we say start with work as an input. We all know that the working poor are happier than the idle poor, right? So to generate that, let's just get going, and that's what we do at our mission. And so I started to cast a vision for Jerry. I said, "Jerry, what if you just got a job? What if you saved your money while you were in shelter until you had enough to get that apartment, that down payment, that first month's rent?" And he stopped eating for a minute. I could tell he was contemplating. And then he said, we're in a restaurant, mind you. He said, "You know, I had a job washing dishes once. I kind of liked that." So while my wife's engaging in conversation with him, I slip out of the booth. I go to the hostess stand and I said, "Hey, I'm getting to know this guy over here, and he likes to wash dishes. He says he's had a job like that in the past. You got anything?" And they said, "Yeah, actually we do." Handed me an application, gave the application to Jerry. He filled it out, came back, went through the interview, got the job. And 3 months later today, he's not only employed, but they've given him more hours and a raise on top of that. Jerry, to federal statisticians, may just be one of the 553,000 homeless people that you and I keep reading about in the news. But to me, he's a guy who needed to be encouraged. He needed inspiration. He needed to be challenged. And he also needed to be held accountable. With Jerry, we won. Now I want to tell you about Scott real quickly to wrap up. Scott is a guy who was in our long-term program, our Center for Virtue and Work, and we have a program in there called Forge. From the name of it, you can tell it's not a very easy program. In fact, the first phase of this program is a service phase where the guys are working alongside our staff in a position at the mission. And then they move into an education phase where they take classes like government and legal living, stewardship and economics, 7 steps to Christian maturity, and others. And then they move on from that phase to another one where they begin a work readiness program where they're learning computer literacy, mock interviews, resume writing, understanding their value that they add to an employer when they work well. That also. And so, and then you move on from that phase into a work internship phase. So now we've developed partner employers in our city, and the guys coming out of our program are entering into a work internship with those employers in a coaching context. And then from there, we go on to independence and full-time employment. That's kind of the program. Scott was in phase 2. He was in phase 2 where he's just beginning to apply for work internship with our partner employers, and he's excited about it when he received notification from the Social Security Administration about a disability application that he had put in more than a year ago. And they said, you're approved. Now, mind you, in our program, you have to turn away from all government assistance to enter into it and to get through it. And they told him that he has $4,000 a month back pay that would come for a number of months, followed with $980 a month thereafter, and how sad it was to be with Scott in my office and to watch him put his head in his hands and struggle with that decision, knowing he's got a path toward independence or he could take the money and run. And unfortunately, he put his food stamp card back in his pocket and he left the program to enter into a life of dependency instead of one that's flourishing. With Jerry, we won. With Scott, we lost. And as I was lamenting that loss, a graduate from our long-term program trying to console me, said, hey, James, don't beat yourself up too badly about this. A free ride is a hard deal to beat. And to a great extent, that has been our struggle, the free ride. I think over the last 20 years, what I've learned is that I'm not fighting poverty so much as I am fighting dependency, and often dependency on the state. It reminds me of what Marvin Olasky said in Tragedy of American Compassion: dependency is merely slavery with a smiling mask. Those are words to remember. And I think that it's probably good for us to ask, and we've been asking these questions, and I know we're going to have lunch here in just a moment, so I'll wrap up. But how did this happen? And I think maybe one thing that we've done is we've forgotten that what was once a very common thought, and actually published on the back of some charity periodicals in the late 1890s, that said intelligent giving and intelligent withholding are alike true charity. And maybe we also have failed to take heed of Tocqueville's warning in his memoir on pauperism, when he spoke of the welfare state, which he called, legal charity. That's what he called it. He called the welfare state legal charity. And he was talking about the detriment of this system on civil society. And he said, rather than uniting the rich and the poor into one people, legal charity has disengaged the only link that could bring them together. And so, how do we fix all of this? Well, certainly Heritage has more work to do, and so do I. And so as you press on, I will too, in encouraging local church members and good neighbors to be bold, to maybe meet that person under the bridge, or that one who's been sleeping in his car, or maybe that person who's standing in the foyer of a rescue mission and say, hey, what's your name? And then begin to build that which is most likely to really address the underlying problem of chronic poverty, which is a real friendship. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree with me that that was just a really fitting end to sum up all of the themes of the day. And I want to thank you all for being a part of this. We have held this forum each year for a number of years now for the purpose of building a network of people who are fighting poverty and restoring well-being at a federal level, a state level, on the ground with the individuals, as you've heard today. We're about to offer you lunch in the foyer, but according to the theme of the day, the most important thing is not the material good of the sandwich you're going to get. It's the relational conversations that will happen and connect you, and we hope you'll be back next year to maintain these relationships and build with us towards helping more of our neighbors in need overcome poverty and experience flourishing and well-being. I'll just mention two more things. The World Magazine profiling Watered Gardens and the Hope Award is in the lobby on the information table. Please grab one of those. And this program will be online and archived for your reference if you'd like to share it with any of your friends or others that you think should know about this effort over the years. So with that, please join me in thanking all our presenters and have a wonderful day.